Before dawn in March of 1997, a police captain was patrolling the outskirts of a small town in North Carolina when, up ahead, he saw there was this Jeep parked on the shoulder of the highway with its headlights on. Now, the vehicle was suspicious enough that the captain pulled over and he walked up to the Jeep. And as he got closer to it, he heard the engine running and he saw the driver's side window was down, but when he walked around to that side of the car, he saw nobody was inside. However, as he was standing there, a cell phone on the passenger seat began to ring. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do. So if that's of interest to you, the next time you go on vacation with the follow button and all your friends, be sure to take lots of pictures. But when you post those pictures to social media, be sure you first systematically Photoshop the follow button out of every picture. Okay, let's get into today's story. In the early morning hours of Saturday, March 29, 1997, a blonde 26-year-old waitress named Kim Medlin carried a tray of filet mignon through a topless bar in Charlotte, North Carolina, while wearing a leotard and tights. She made her way through the cigar smoke-filled room, past the stage where all the half-naked women were busy pole dancing. Kim worked here at the men's club 3 or 4 nights a week, and for the most part, she liked the job. It paid well, and by working the night shift, it left her days free, so she could focus on her 2 real passions, which were taking care of her horses and decorating her brand new house. So Kim and her husband Bridger had recently bought a 7-acre plot of land outside the nearby town of Monroe, where Bridger had actually grown up. They'd spent the past year building their dream home, including a barn for their 3 horses, and now that the construction was done, they had finally started moving in and decorating. Now, as Kim delivered the filet mignons to a table of middle-aged businessmen, she glanced over at the clock on the wall, and she felt a surge of excitement when she saw that there was less than an hour left in her shift. Kim had the next 3 days off, and she planned to use all that free time to finish some of the smaller moving projects that still needed to get done, like just unpacking boxes and hanging some pictures. So she flashed the businessmen a smile and then went to check on her other tables. An hour later, a little after 2 a.m., Kim walked out the back entrance of the bar, now wearing a baggy sweatshirt instead of her work uniform, and she called out a goodbye over her shoulder to some coworkers, and then walked over to where her red Jeep was parked along the side of the building. She got in, dropped her purse onto the cow print seat cover on the passenger seat, turned on the car, and then turned on some music for the hour-long drive home. A half an hour later, Kim drove south down Old Charlotte Highway, a secluded 2-lane road that was pretty much deserted at this hour. She used to find this commute kind of relaxing, but lately, it had been making her nervous to be driving alone late at night. And the reason for that was because a couple of weeks ago, while she was driving home from work around this same time of night, she'd been involved in a really scary road rage incident. Another vehicle had come up from behind and started tailgating her and honking their horn at her repeatedly for really no apparent reason. Kim had been afraid that this was a customer from the men's club who was now following her home, and it freaked her out so much that she'd actually pulled over into a convenience store parking lot because she saw there was a police car parked in there as well, and so she'd gone right over to the officer to ask for help. He'd promised to go and try and track down this road rager, and he'd even sent out a broadcast over the police radio, telling all the other officers to keep an eye out for Kim's car on the night she was working in case anyone gave her more trouble. And so now, even though, that road rager had never been caught, Kim did feel better knowing that the police had her back. But again, because the road rager had not been caught, she was still a bit scared about driving home alone. So tonight, to calm her nerves, she fished out her cell phone out of her purse and just called her husband, Bridger. When he answered, he told her that he was actually on the road too. He was still driving back from a gig DJing at a prom in a town 2 hours away, but he was almost home. After chatting for a few minutes, Bridger told Kim that he was actually pulling into their driveway and that he would call her right back once he got inside the house. So Kim said fine and said goodbye, and they hung up, and she kept on driving. Then, about 15 minutes later, so a little before 3 a.m., her phone rang, and it was Bridger again, calling back like he had promised he would. And he asked Kim if she was close, and she told him that she was just passing by Union Station Restaurant, which meant she was maybe about 20 minutes away from home. Bridger said he was pretty tired and he was getting ready for bed, and in case he was asleep by the time she got in, he wished her goodnight. And Kim said goodnight back, and then she hung up and she put her phone down on the passenger seat. But just as Kim turned her attention back towards the road, a sudden bright light almost blinded her. She looked in the rearview mirror and saw headlights right behind her. About an hour later, Kim's husband Bridger sat up in bed and looked over at the clock on his nightstand. It was 3:59 a.m., an hour after having spoken to Kim. I mean, she should have been home 20 minutes after that phone call, and she still wasn't back. So he got out of bed and he checked every room in their two-story house, but Kim wasn't in any of them. There was no sign of her. Then Bridger looked out the window and he saw her Jeep wasn't in the driveway either. So at this point, he hurried into the kitchen and he picked up the phone and he dialed Kim's cell phone number. And it rang a few times, and then a strange male voice answered. Bridger asked who he was speaking to, and the man told him he was a police officer with the Monroe Public Safety Department. Bridger asked him, okay, well, where's my wife? And the officer told him that he didn't know. He had just come across a red Jeep idling on the side of the road and found this phone inside of it, and it was ringing, and so he answered it. But he said, there's nobody here. Several minutes later, so this is a little bit after 4 a.m. on March 29, 1997, Assistant Chief Bobby Hulk, a police investigator with the Monroe Public Safety Department, drove north along Old Charlotte Highway. He drove his patrol car past parking lots and houses until he reached the very edge of town. And finally, he saw what he was looking for: a red Jeep parked along the opposite side of the road, with another patrol car parked right behind it. He pulled a U-turn and parked on the shoulder, and as he got out of his car, he recognized Captain David Simpson standing there, waiting for him. Simpson told Chief Hulk that he had just found this Jeep idling on the side of the road about 15 minutes ago with its headlights on, and he had walked up. There had been nobody inside of it, but when he looked in, there was a cell phone, and it began to ring. And so, acting on instinct, he answered the phone, and it was a man named Bridger Medlin who was calling saying, I'm looking for my wife. This is her phone. She hasn't come home. And Captain Simpson also said that he actually recognized this Jeep from a random run-in he had had 2 weeks earlier outside of a convenience store with Kim Medlin. And so he put it together and he's like, okay, Bridger's calling. This is definitely Kim's car, but Kim's nowhere to be found. And Hulk actually recognized Kim's name because he actually happened to be friends with Kim's husband, Bridger. And so he pulled out his flashlight and he began looking inside the Jeep, and right away he saw there was a wallet lying open on the passenger seat. And when he looked inside the wallet, there were credit cards, there was cash, but there was like this clear section of the wallet where obviously you would slide your driver's license, and there was nothing there. So it very much looked like her license had been pulled out on purpose. Now, their initial theory was, okay, well, maybe Kim got pulled over by a police officer and took out her license to hand to the cop. But in a department as small as Monroe's, there were only a few officers on duty at this time of night. And when Assistant Chief Hulk asked Captain Simpson, had any of the on-duty officers pulled anybody over that night, Simpson was already all over it. He had checked. And he said, no, none of our officers pulled anybody over. So this made Hulk wonder if maybe Kim had been pulled over by somebody posing as a cop. There had actually been dozens of reports over the years of so-called blue light bandits pretending to be police officers in order to harass drivers, especially young women. But those cases were really quite rare, even though they did happen. So Hulk didn't want to jump to any conclusions quite yet. Just then, Hulk heard a truck engine and saw headlights approaching up the highway. So he set the wallet back down on the seat and then walked over to where a black pickup truck was now pulling to a stop right behind Hulk's car. A tall man with blonde hair got out of the driver's seat, and right away Hulk knew who it was. It was his friend and Kim's husband, Bridger. And Bridger looked frantic, and he demanded to know what had happened to his wife. But Hulk told him to calm down, that they were here to try to figure out what happened to his wife and where she went. Hulk went on to say that, look, we showed up and we just found her car here. But there were no broken windows or slashed tires or any sign of a struggle, so it was possible that maybe Kim just ran into car trouble and maybe she went out to go find help. But then, without asking for permission, Bridger pushed past Hulk and just climbed right inside of the Jeep's driver's seat and said, well, let's test your theory right now and see whether the car was working. Hulk told him to get out of the Jeep, But Bridger just totally ignored him, and then he put his wife's car in drive and moved it forward a few inches. Then he put it in reverse, and he drove it backward, ultimately parking it in its original place, showing that it worked just fine. And even though at this point Hulk was kind of annoyed with Bridger for what he had just done, he couldn't help but think, this is bad, something's going on here. And so Hulk walked over to his car, and he radioed the dispatcher for reinforcements. And he asked them to bring a police dog so they could try to track Kim's scent in case she left on foot. A few minutes later, 2 more police cars pulled up to the scene, and a few officers and a police dog got out. Hulk opened the doors to the Jeep, and the dog went in and sniffed around, getting familiar with the scent of Kim's belongings. Then the dog seemed to pick up a trail on the ground, and so the officers told Bridger, who clearly wanted to go with them, to stay put, stay with your truck, and then they followed the dog down the road for about 100 yards or so until it turned onto a driveway. Hulk and the others followed the dog up this long driveway towards a small house nestled in the trees right off the highway, and the dog sniffed all the way up to the garage and then stopped. That was where Kim's trail ended, and so Hulk went up to the house and rang the doorbell, and a minute later, a man answered, and despite the late hour, he looked totally awake and not particularly surprised to see cops at his door. Hulk asked the man who he was and whether or not he had seen or heard anything unusual in the past couple of hours near his property. The man said his name was Nathan Hargett, and about an hour ago, so maybe around 3:45 a.m., he'd been woken up by a strange car loitering near his garage. Nathan said he hadn't recognized the car, but he noticed that it had Texas plates, and that there also had been a woman with blonde hair in the back seat. Hulk asked Nathan for permission to search his property, and Nathan told them to go right ahead. And so Hulk directed the other officers to search the inside of the house, while he clicked on his flashlight and headed over to the garage. When he got there, he turned the handle of a door on the side of the garage, and he found it was unlocked. So he pushed the door open, and he shined his flashlight inside, but all he saw was a truck and some gardening tools. There was no sign of Kim. By the time dawn broke around 6 a.m. that morning, this had become officially a missing persons case. So police began a search of the woods around the Old Charlotte Highway with help from members of the community. Meanwhile, Hulk and Simpson went back to the station to speak to one of the dispatchers who had been on duty that night. After speaking to that homeowner, Nathan, and searching his house and his garage, he had been ruled out as a suspect. So now they were focused on finding that car with the Texas plates that Nathan had seen loitering outside of his garage. So they were hoping that maybe there was a report of a traffic stop or maybe a suspicious car in the area or anything that might help figure out who was driving that car. But the dispatcher said again that really there had been no stops, nothing that night. However, there had been one incident in the area that night. It was around 2 a.m., so it was about an hour before Kim was last heard from. They'd gotten a call about a car that had run into a ditch not too far from where Kim's Jeep was found. Hulk asked who had responded to that call, and the dispatcher said it was car 491, which was driven by a young rookie officer named Josh Griffin. Hulk immediately gave Officer Griffin a phone call and asked if he had seen or heard anything unusual while he was out responding to that car in the ditch. But Griffin said no. He actually said that his shift was over around the time that driver had flagged him down for help, so he had actually just called for a tow truck, and when it got there, maybe a little bit after 2:30 a.m., Griffin said he just went home. Hulk hung up the phone feeling pretty disappointed. Bridger said the last time he heard from his wife Kim was around 3 a.m., so if this car was already being towed away by 2:30 a.m., then it definitely was not the same car that Nathan saw loitering outside of his garage, and the driver of that car in the ditch was likely not a suspect. Hulk sighed in frustration, but then another idea occurred to him. He asked Captain Simpson to elaborate on that random run-in he had had with Kim a couple of weeks earlier. Now, this was sort of a long shot to bring it up again, but Hulk wondered if maybe the same driver from the road rage incident could have maybe come back and, maybe chased Kim off the road or something. Simpson said he would go dig up the report that he had filed on the incident, and then he left to go find it. About half an hour later, Hulk sat at his desk reading through a copy of the road rage police report. It said that in the very early morning hours of Saturday, March 15th, so exactly 2 weeks before Kim's disappearance, Kim had pulled into a convenience store and flagged down Captain Simpson and another officer named Roger Griffin. So Officer Josh Griffin is the one who responded to the car stuck in the ditch. Officer Roger Griffin is actually Josh's father, and he was with Captain Simpson that night. So the report said that Simpson and his partner, Roger Griffin, had actually caught up with the car that was harassing Kim a little bit further down the road. There were two men inside the car, Eric Williams and George Connell, and they claimed that they thought Kim was actually the one harassing them by flashing her lights at them. And so to Simpson and to Griffin, it seemed like a big misunderstanding, so the officers had just let them go. But Hulk, now looking at this through a very different lens, felt like he needed to speak to Eric and George regardless. And so in the report, he found the contact information for Eric and George, and he called them both up. But it turned out they both had airtight alibis for the night of Kim's disappearance. But even still, it struck Hulk as very odd that Kim had gone missing from her car on the same road at the same time of night and on the same night of the week as the road rage incident just 2 weeks earlier. And he had a hard time believing it was all just, one big coincidence. The next day, just after sunset on Sunday, March 30th, Hulk drove down Westwood Industrial Drive, a deserted dead-end street at the edge of town, about 2 miles from where Kim's Jeep was found. And as he was driving, he saw at the end of the street there were a couple of police cars parked there. And so he pulled his own car behind them, and he got out. He walked into the trees where he could see the beams of several flashlights moving around in the darkness. And as he got closer, he saw officers putting up police tape around a small clearing. And then, on the ground in that clearing, he saw a pair of feet in sneakers poking out from underneath a pile of roofing shingles and branches. The police had gotten a call earlier that evening from two men who were part of the community search effort for Kim, and they said to police that they had found a body in the woods in the spot, but they hadn't touched it. And so now with Hulk on the scene, the forensics team removed the shingles and branches that were covering the body, and Hulk pulled out his flashlight and knelt down to get a better look. And he saw right away it was a deceased woman, and it was definitely Kim Medlin. She was only wearing a pair of shorts, a bra, and a sweatshirt that had been pulled up over her head. One side of her face was very badly beaten, and there were also cuts and bruises all over her neck, and there were some scrapes on her knees. And her necklace and wedding ring were still on, so her killer had not robbed her. Hulk stood back as the forensics team untangled Kim's sweatshirt from around her wrists so they could collect clippings of her fingernails, in case she had maybe scratched off a trace of her killer's DNA. And as Hulk watched one of these forensics officers go to put the sweatshirt inside of an evidence bag, he suddenly noticed something and shouted for the officer to stop. Hulk stepped closer and he shined his flashlight on the sweatshirt's fabric, and it revealed a shoe print. And so he told the officers to send that sweatshirt to the crime lab and see if they could figure out the size and type of shoe that had left that print. But while he would have to wait for those results, he knew he had a couple of other big clues to help narrow down a suspect. The first was the location of Kim's body. Westwood Industrial Drive was known as Lover's Lane, so basically a secluded, out-of-the-way spot where people often went to be alone. And the fact that Kim's killer had thought to take her there meant they were probably a local and familiar with the area. Now, it was still theoretically possible that she'd just been run off the road by some stranger for some reason, or, maybe a customer had followed her home from work, or maybe it was a blue light bandit impersonating a police officer. But the second big clue was that there was no sign of a struggle at Kim's Jeep. And because of that, Hulk did not think she had been kidnapped by a stranger. He thought it was far more likely that she had gotten out of her car for somebody that she knew and trusted. The very next day, Monday, March 31st, Hulk sat down in an interrogation room with his friend and first murder suspect, Kim's husband, Bridger. Bridger had been really pushy and really in some ways over-involved in the investigation from literally the moment Kim's Jeep was found. He'd messed with the crime scene by getting into the Jeep without permission, and now Hulk had information that Bridger had lied about his alibi. So when Kim first went missing, Bridger had told the police that he got home around 2:30 that morning, he called Kim for a brief chat a little before 3, and then he immediately went to bed. But now, a police officer had told Hulk that he had seen Bridger's black pickup truck driving around the center of town around 2:30 a.m., which was nowhere near Bridger's house, and nowhere near the route he would have taken to get back from his DJing gig. So once Hulk sat down, immediately he could see that Bridger was visibly distraught. I mean, he's just learned that his wife was found dead, But Hulk had a job to do, and so he cut right to the chase. And he said to Bridger that, hey, this other officer said they saw your truck driving around in town. It contradicts your alibi. Why did you lie? And right away, Bridger exploded. He was so mad. And he shouted at Hulk that he couldn't believe at a time like this, you would accuse me of lying to you. You're insinuating that I hurt my wife. I didn't do this. He also yelled at Hulk for just wasting time looking at him as a suspect when there were so many clues pointing to a different story, like the lack of a struggle at the Jeep and the rolled down window and missing driver's license, all of which made it look like a traffic stop gone wrong. Bridger said he knew Kim better than anybody, and she would never, ever get out of her car in the middle of the night for a stranger, especially after that road rage incident 2 weeks earlier. She was on edge. She never would have done that. When Hulk left the interrogation room a few minutes later, he told his team to track down security footage from around town on the night Kim was killed to see if there was proof that really Bridger was driving around when he said he was home. Because right now they had no evidence to show he was lying, and they actually just had to let Bridger go. But when Bridger was leaving, he'd been so angry and so defensive, it sort of made Hulk think that maybe Bridger did this. And in fact, the fact that Bridger had brought up that his wife would never have gotten out of the car in the middle of the night for a stranger, well, that only reinforced that she might have gotten out of the car for you, Bridger, because she knew and trusted you. But also, Hulk was thinking that another person or group of people that Kim might have gotten out of the car for would be police. Now, Hulk already knew that there were no police that pulled anybody over that night, but somebody could have pretended to be a police officer, a blue light bandit. That was a theory that did sort of make sense. Hulk thought about that bulletin that had gone out over the police radio 2 weeks ago, telling officers to be on the lookout for Kim's Jeep at certain times of the night because of that road rage incident. Now, police radios were not private, so anybody with a police scanner could have been listening in, and what they would have heard is, well, around this time of the night, this woman, Kim, often drives this road all by herself. And they basically could have just been waiting for her, knowing she was vulnerable. So Hulk picked up his phone and he began calling around to other police departments in the region. And he actually found out there had been 2 separate reports of blue light bandits harassing women recently. Now, one of the culprits had already been caught, and he was in jail when Kim was killed, so it could not have been him. But the other suspect still hadn't been found. A couple of days later, on April 4th, Assistant Chief Bobby Hulk slammed down the phone in frustration and crossed another name off a list on his notepad. It had been 5 days since Kim's body was found, and all the leads he'd had at the start of the investigation were now coming back as dead ends. When he tracked down surveillance footage from the night of Kim's disappearance, there was no sign of her husband Bridger's truck driving through town until 4 a.m., after Kim's Jeep had been found by police. So the officer who claimed to have seen Bridger's truck driving around at 2:30 did appear to have been mistaken, as Bridger said. Hulk also had reached out to Kim's manager and co-workers at the bar she worked at, thinking maybe her killer might have been a patron who followed her home. But none of them knew of any problems she had had with customers. Meanwhile, Hulk's team had spoken to a man who worked the night shift at a business that was near where Kim's Jeep had been found. He said he had left work a little before 3 a.m. on the night that Kim disappeared. And as he was waiting to turn onto Old Charlotte Highway, he had seen her red Jeep go past. And right afterwards, he saw another car that was going in the other direction make a sort of sudden, sharp 3-point turn and speed right after the Jeep. The man had said that this other car had lights on the roof and reflective tape on the rear, and he thought, or at least assumed, it was a police car, but he didn't get a good look at the markings. Now, Hulk knew that every single Monroe police officer that was on duty that night was accounted for, and they hadn't pulled anybody over at the time that Kim went missing. However, this new information certainly did support the theory that maybe Kim's killer was posing as a police officer, that they were a blue light bandit. So, Hulk had spent the past couple of days trying to track down witnesses who had seen that other blue light bandit who was recently reported in a nearby town but had never been caught, but he kept coming up dry. Nobody knew anything that could help track down that suspect. So, it seemed like the investigation was really starting to slow down. But then, Hulk's phone rang, and he answered it, And it was an expert from the forensics lab who had just finished analyzing that shoe print that had been found on Kim's sweatshirt. And so Hulk leaned forward in nervous anticipation as the expert told him the results. And when he did, Hulk knew exactly how to find Kim's killer. Based on that shoe print, witness testimony, and other forensic evidence, this is what police believe happened to Kim Medlin on March 29, 1997. Around 3 a.m., the killer was driving down Old Charlotte Highway. They'd been prowling around for hours, pulling over young women for minor traffic infractions or sometimes for doing nothing wrong at all. And as they drove, they saw a familiar red Jeep pass by. The killer had seen that Jeep coming down this road several nights a week, and they'd sort of grown obsessed with the young blonde woman who was driving it. And now they decided it was finally time to do something about that. So they pulled an abrupt three-point turn and raced after the Jeep and flipped on their car's flashing lights. Pretty soon, the Jeep pulled over onto the shoulder, and the killer got out of their car and walked up to the driver's side window. The woman inside naturally rolled down the window, and she handed over her driver's license, which said her name was Kim Medlin. And then she politely asked what the problem was, and the killer just told her to get out of the car. Now, Kim was visibly confused, but she did as she was told. And once she was out of the car, the killer slapped a pair of handcuffs onto her wrists and then dragged her over to their car and tossed her in the back seat. Then the killer got in the driver's seat of their car as Kim began crying and insisting that she didn't do anything wrong. Why was she being arrested? But the killer wasn't listening. Their mind was racing as they realized that even though they'd been dreaming about this moment for weeks, they actually didn't really have a plan for what they would do next. And so after a moment, they pulled over and just idled for a minute while they figured out what their next move was going to be. And then an idea came to them. They put their car in drive and continued down the highway. And as they turned onto a secluded dead-end road, Kim in the back seat suddenly got very quiet. And so the killer picked up on that and looked in the rearview mirror and saw her moving around, fiddling with something behind her back. And the killer suddenly realized that in all their excitement, they'd forgotten to lock the rear doors. The killer immediately tried to lock their doors with the power locks, but before they could, the rear door opened and Kim jumped out of the moving car. And so the killer came to a hard stop, they leapt out of the car, and they ran back for Kim, who was lying in the middle of the road, her hands are still cuffed behind her, and without even thinking, the killer lifted up their flashlight, and they smashed it into Kim's head, and then they stomped on her back and broke her neck. But the killer wasn't done. They reached down and they put their flashlight around Kim's neck, basically put it up against her throat, and then they pulled back on their arms, basically creating sort of a noose around her neck with this flashlight. And they held it like that, and they pulled as tight as they could until Kim stopped moving. After that, they dragged her body off the road and into the woods, where they removed her handcuffs and covered her body with branches and debris to hide it. Then the killer went home and cleaned up their car, making sure there was no evidence that would tie them to the murder. But they didn't realize they had actually left behind one crucial piece of evidence at the scene, that shoe print on Kim's sweatshirt. The print had a very distinct V-shaped pattern on the tread, which made it very easy to identify. And so weeks later, the forensics lab traced that print back to a shoe that was made by the Thorogood Company, a supplier of military and uniform footwear. And that particular model happened to be the exact same shoe issued to officers in the Monroe Public Safety Department, which meant Kim's killer was not just posing as a police officer. They were a police officer. The killer was Officer Josh Griffin, the off-duty rookie cop who had responded to a car in a ditch about a half an hour before Kim went missing. It would turn out Josh had learned the details about Kim's vehicle and late-night driving patterns from his father, Officer Roger Griffin, after his father told him about that road rage incident that he and Captain Simpson had responded to on March 15th. And so Josh had basically been on the lookout for Kim's Jeep ever since. Josh Griffin was arrested on May 30th, 1997, about 2 months after Kim's murder. He was eventually convicted of first-degree kidnapping and murder and sentenced to life in prison. As for his motive, the best we can offer is he became obsessed with Kim and attacked her. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, MrBallen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen, produced by Jeremy Bone. This episode was written by Kate Gallagher. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Cole Lacasio. Additional audio editing by Jordan Stidham. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Minata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. And just a reminder, every new and exclusive episode we put out on the MrBallen podcast, you can also now watch on the MrBallen YouTube channel that very same day. And trust me, some of these stories you truly have to see to believe. Again, my YouTube channel is just called MrBallen. If you want to listen to episodes 1 week early and ad-free, you can subscribe to SiriusXM Podcast Plus on Apple Podcasts or visit SiriusXM.com/Podcast Plus to listen with Spotify or another app of your choice. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. In June of 2005, a customer at a gas station in Derry, New Hampshire, carried a prepaid cell phone to the counter. They paid for it in cash, and then afterwards they went out to their car and cut open the packaging. Then once they had the phone, they dialed a number to activate it. But when the customer service rep asked for their name, the customer hesitated. Because the whole reason they'd bought this prepaid phone in the first place was specifically so nobody could trace the calls back to their real identity. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the Strange, Dark, and Mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to make the follow button a nice home-cooked meal. But be sure you first douse it with liquid laxative. Okay, let's get into today's story. On an afternoon in June of 2005, a 57-year-old truck driver named Jack Reed took a sip of his margarita at a barbecue in a park in Derry, New Hampshire. Now, he usually didn't drink, but today he was celebrating. It was his daughter Megan's high school graduation party. And this was a big deal for Jack. He'd grown up in the foster care system with nothing, and he'd worked really hard to ensure that his kids were set up for a better life than he had. So he was just really proud of Megan for making the right choices and finishing school. Now he looked over and he saw Megan sitting at a picnic table with her brother, Jack Jr., and also their mother, Virginia. Even though he and Virginia were not together anymore, they were still on good terms, and he was glad the whole family could be there for this special occasion. But then, Jack tensed up as he spotted somebody else who was walking across the grass toward them, Megan's boyfriend, Walter. So Megan and Walter had moved in together recently, and Jack was definitely not thrilled about it. He didn't have anything against Walter in particular, but his daughter was just 18 years old, and he thought that she was definitely too young to be living with a boyfriend. But Jack didn't want to pick a fight about it on a day like this. So instead, he actually got up and walked over to Walter and gave him a big friendly hug and said he was glad to see him. Then they both sat down at the table and joined the family's conversation, and as Jack took another sip of his margarita, he actually felt himself relax. That evening, after the party was over, Jack drove his car home and stopped at a gas station along the way. He parked at the pump, he went inside, and then passed the cashier a few bills for a tank of gas, and also a lottery ticket. Jack was a regular lottery player, and even though he'd never won anything particularly big, he was always hoping that one day he would hit the jackpot and strike it rich. So he put the ticket in his pocket and then went back outside and filled up his car. Then he got in his car and he drove a few more blocks to his home, which was a trailer parked behind a warehouse on the edge of town. And one big reason Jack chose to live here was because there was plenty of room to park all of his work vehicles. including a large red and black dump truck. After years of working as a truck driver, Jack had built his own trucking business from the ground up. He did garbage removal and moving and other odd jobs, and he was making a decent living. But he still lived frugally in his rented trailer so he could save up for retirement. His goal was to save enough so that in a couple of years, once Jack Jr. was done with school, he could leave the cold New Hampshire winters behind and move to sunny, beautiful Las Vegas. He'd gotten the idea a couple of years ago when he'd done a moving job for a local self-made millionaire who was moving from New Hampshire to Vegas. He saw the millionaire as a huge success story, and he believed that if he worked hard enough, or maybe got lucky enough, he could follow in this same path. Now, Jack got out of his car and he walked over to his trailer. He opened up the door and he went inside. He turned on the lights and he was just about to sit down to take off his shoes when he heard a noise outside. Immediately, he went to the window and pulled back the curtains and he looked outside into the woods behind the property, but he didn't see anything. Still, he felt his heart racing, and he actually had to take a few deep breaths to calm himself down. So almost 2 years ago, there had been an incident where Jack heard someone creeping around outside his trailer. He'd grabbed his gun and went out to confront them, and he'd seen a man standing at the edge of the woods. The man had stared right at him and actually called out his name. Jack had actually fired his gun at this man, who then ran away into the woods and never came back. But Jack had never figured out what the encounter was about. As far as he knew, he didn't have any enemies, so it really just didn't make any sense. But again, since this strange guy was never caught, Jack was still very on edge whenever he heard strange noises outside and around his trailer. Now, as he looked out the window and he felt sure that there was nobody there, Jack closed the curtains and took the lottery ticket out of his pocket. He sat down at the table and he started scratching off the silver foil with a coin. And he was not a winner this time. But it didn't dampen his mood. Next time he knew might be his lucky break. A couple of weeks later, on the morning of Monday, June 27th, Jack climbed up into his dump truck and rolled down the windows. It was already pretty hot outside, and he was on his way to the only job he had lined up for that day, a trash disposal gig that would likely only take a few hours. So he started the truck, and as he pulled out onto the road, his cell phone rang. He answered it, and a man spoke and said his name was Charlie, and that he had heard Jack did some work, hauling stuff away, and that, he had this new barn that really needed to be cleaned out, and could Jack do it? Jack said sure, he could actually do it that afternoon. And then he grabbed his logbook off the passenger seat, and he flipped to a blank page, and he scribbled down Charlie's name and address, which was in Deerfield, almost 30 miles away. Jack told Charlie he would let him know as soon as he was on the way, and then the two men hung up. Around 3 p.m. that afternoon, Jack drove down a very secluded 2-lane road in Deerfield. It was sweltering outside, and he was already exhausted and dripping with sweat from his trash disposal gig that morning. He had no idea what to expect going into this barn cleaning job with this guy Charlie, but he was hoping it wouldn't take too long. Jack slowed down as the trees to his right parted, and a gravel driveway appeared. He turned onto the driveway, and a few seconds later, he pulled up right outside of a white 2-story house with a big barn out back. Jack parked his dump truck and walked right up to the front door. He rang the doorbell, and a moment later, the door opened. 2 days later, on the afternoon of June 29th, Jack's daughter, Megan, and her boyfriend, Walter, walked up to the front door of Jack's trailer. Megan noticed that Jack's dump truck was not parked outside, which seemed wrong, and so she immediately felt this knot in her stomach. About an hour earlier, Megan had gotten a call from her mother, Virginia, saying that Jack had not shown up to a job that morning and he was not answering his phone. This was unlike him, so Megan had said that she and Walter would just go over to his trailer and make sure he was okay. Now, initially, Megan had assumed her dad had just overslept or maybe forgot about the job. But now, it looked like he'd actually left for work because the dump truck wasn't there, but never actually made it to the job. But nonetheless, Megan knocked on the trailer door, just to be sure her dad really wasn't home, and there was no answer. And so at this point, Megan called her mom to tell her what she had seen and, the fact that her dad wasn't here. And she also told her mom that she was starting to feel pretty worried. And then a few minutes later, Virginia pulled up in her car. Megan, Walter, and Virginia all just stayed there right at the trailer all afternoon, hoping that maybe Jack would just show up at some point. And the whole time they're calling him over and over again, but it just kept going straight to voicemail. And then finally, around 6:30 p.m., when still they had not seen or heard from Jack, they decided it was time to call the police. On Tuesday, July 5th, so 6 days after Jack was reported missing by his family, Derry police detective Mike Hoole pulled into the parking lot of a Target store about an hour's drive south in Saugus, Massachusetts. Hoole slowed down and began to sort of slow roll through the rows of cars, keeping an eye out for one particular vehicle. Hoole was in charge of Jack's missing persons case, which had not really been going anywhere so far. According to his family, the last time anybody had seen or heard from Jack was actually on June 27th, so 2 days before he was reported missing to the police. But his family could not think of anywhere Jack might have gone or anybody who might want to hurt him. So initially, Hoole had figured that Jack must have just driven off for some time alone, and that he would just come home sooner or later. But that morning, he'd gotten another call from Jack's daughter, Megan. She said the family had put up all these missing posters around town for Jack, and somebody had called her and said they actually saw Jack's dump truck at this particular Target in Saugus, more than 40 miles away from Derry. Now, this tip was unique enough that Hoole decided he would just drive out and take a look for himself. And now, as he slowly made his way towards the back of this parking lot, he saw it, a red and black dump truck parked near the back corner. So Hoole stopped his car and he walked over to look at this truck, and right away he saw the license plate confirmed this truck was definitely Jack's. When Hoole peeked in the driver's side window, though, he didn't see anybody inside. But there were flies buzzing around the back of the truck, basically the open section of the dump truck. There was something in there the flies were attracted to. And there was also very clearly a rotten, awful smell wafting out of the back of this truck. And so Hoole put on some gloves and he climbed up the side of the dump truck. Now, the actual bed of this dump truck was covered by a tarp. And so Hoole grabbed the tarp and he pulled it back, but he still did not have an unobstructed view, because whatever was in the bed was also wrapped in plastic, and quite a bit of it. So he pulled out a knife and began cutting through the plastic. Less than an hour later, Detective Hoole stood by as workers from the medical examiner's office loaded Jack's body into their van, and he was still wrapped up in plastic. Hoole really wanted to get a look at Jack's body to figure out how he died, but that would require cutting through all the plastic that he was wrapped in. And Hoole knew he needed to leave all that intact for evidentiary purposes. So he'd just have to wait until the autopsy to find out the cause of death here. But from the way Jack's body had been disposed of, hidden in a parking lot 40 miles from his house, Hoole was already guessing that this was 1, a murder, and 2, it was carefully planned, probably by somebody that Jack knew. Hoole had already found out from the family that Jack had 5 children with 2 different women, and so he figured there could be some hidden tensions between any of them. But he also thought the murder could be tied to Jack's business. Now, as far as Jack's family knew, everything Jack did with his business was above board. But it's entirely possible that he might have gotten involved with sketchy people, or maybe done something that made a client angry that the family didn't know about. Also, leaving Jack's dead body in the back of his own dump truck definitely seemed like a way to send a message. So, once the forensics team had taken photos and swabbed the truck for DNA and fingerprints, Hoole pulled on a pair of latex gloves and opened up the driver's side door. There was no blood inside the cabin of the truck, no sign of a weapon, and really nothing that struck him as unusual or helpful. That is, until he saw the logbook that was tucked into a pocket on the passenger side door. He reached for it, pulled it out, and began to flip through it, and he saw there was a list of all of Jack's appointments, along with the names, addresses, and phone numbers of the clients who had hired him. The last job that was recorded in this book was on the morning of June 27th, back in Derry, where Jack lived. Now, there were no other jobs noted down for that day, but a couple of pages later, on an otherwise blank page, Hoole found an entry that Jack seemed to have scribbled down in a rush. It was just an address, 145 North Road, no town listed, and the name was just Charlie for the client. Hoole placed the logbook inside of an evidence bag and he sealed it. And then, as he sort of looked around the area, he noticed all the security cameras on light posts all over the parking lot, and there happened to be one that was pointing directly at Jack's truck. The next day, so Wednesday, July 6th, Hoole was back at the precinct in Derry, reading over an autopsy report that had just been sent over from the Massachusetts medical examiner. The description in the report said that Jack had been severely beaten. He had broken ribs, skull fractures, and a softball-sized hole in the side of his head. His face had been so mangled that they'd actually had to pull Jack's dental records to confirm that it was actually him. Hoole thought this level of violence definitely made this murder feel really personal, and it only made him more confident that Jack's killer or killers was somebody who knew him. Just then, Hoole heard a knock at his door, and he looked up as an officer peeked his head into Hull's office and asked him to come take a look at something. So Hull stood up from his desk, and he followed the officer down the hallway to another room where a team of investigators were poring over that security footage from the Target parking lot. Hull watched over their shoulders as the investigators pulled up a specific clip, and he could see from the timestamp in the corner of the screen that this footage was from around 5:30 p.m. on June 27th, which was the day of the last job written in Jack's logbook. Once it was up on the screen, Hull nodded for the investigators to press play, and then he watched as the footage played on screen. And it showed Jack's dump truck pulling into the parking lot, followed closely by a white minivan. After Jack's truck parked, two people got out of the truck. And unfortunately, it was impossible to identify really anything about these people. They couldn't tell if they were men or women or man and woman. It was just totally unclear. However, there was one thing that was definitely true about these people, and it was what they were actually doing. They were clearly dumping Jack's body. One of them went around to the back of the dump truck and checked to make sure that tarp was secure, and then they both walked over to the white minivan, got in, and drove away. And so Hull's mind was racing now, because it looked like there were at least 3 people involved in Jack's murder. There were the 2 people that were just out and about, sort of dealing with the truck, and then whoever was driving the white minivan. But another unfortunate reality was this footage was so fuzzy that they couldn't even pull the license plate for that minivan. And Hull was naturally pretty frustrated by that. But then the investigator said there was actually one more thing he wanted to show him, and he pulled up another portion of security video. This one was from the evening of July 4th, which was 7 days after Jack's dump truck was left abandoned in the parking lot, and 1 day before police, i.e. Hull, found the truck parked in that lot. The investigator told Hull that this footage he was about to see was from a different security camera, which was positioned on the other side of the parking lot from where the dump truck was parked. And then when he hit play, he directed Hull's attention to one particular car pulling into the parking lot. Now, the angle on this car was much closer, so there was a lot more detail visible than in the first video. And as Hull watched, he saw what clearly was a young woman get out of the passenger seat and walk toward the store. Hull leaned in close and squinted, and he realized he knew this woman because it was Jack's own daughter, Megan. Later that day, Hull walked into an interrogation room in the Derry police station, where Megan was waiting for him. When Hull walked in, he made a point to shake her hand and smile, acting as friendly and sympathetic as possible. He did not want to let on that he was looking at her as a suspect, so he didn't mention that they had video of her in the same parking lot where Jack's body was found, just a day before they found it. But as they started talking, Megan actually brought it up herself, that she happened to have been in the exact same lot that her father was ultimately found in. She said she had been shocked when she found out, one, that her father was dead, of course, but also that he was dumped in that Target lot. She had been there recently. She said her boyfriend Walter's sister lived in Saugus, and they had visited her for the 4th of July in an attempt to get their mind off their father's disappearance because at the time, he had not been found yet. Megan said they had unexpectedly decided to spend the night there, so they had driven to the nearest Target to get a contacts case. And when she said that, she just shook her head and said she couldn't believe her dad had basically been right there. She was so close to him. Hull had to admit, this story did not sound totally crazy. After all, in the security video, Megan didn't go anywhere near the actual part of the lot where Jack's truck was parked. But still, he had a hard time believing that this was just one big coincidence. Especially because when he was reviewing what Megan had told the police when she had first reported her father missing, he realized that she had said she last saw her dad on the night of Monday, June 27th, when she and her boyfriend Walter had gone to his place to pick up an air conditioner. But now, Hull knew that was impossible, because the security video showed that Jack was already dead in the parking lot on the night of June 27th. So during this interview with Megan, Hull asked Megan again, when was the last time you saw your father? And once again, without missing a beat, she said it was the night of June 27th. Hull asked her if she was positive about the date, and she said yes, absolutely. So, without tipping his hand that he felt like for sure Megan was lying here, Hull let her go and immediately called in her boyfriend Walter, who had been waiting in the hallway. According to Megan, Walter was the one who actually drove her to that Target in Saugus. Hull wanted to question the couple separately so he could see if there were any contradictions in their stories. But when he spoke to Walter repeated the exact same things Megan had said about why they were in the area and why they went to that Target to get a contacts case. Walter also included the detail about the last time they saw Jack being the night of the 27th. So basically, Walter and Megan's stories are the same. But to Hoole, the only thing he thought when he heard this consistency is that clearly what's happened here is Megan and Walter have rehearsed this story because it is their alibi. But they don't realize there was time-stamped security footage that would contradict it. The following afternoon, Hoole sat at his desk, combing through a copy of Jack's phone records. He'd sent officers out that morning to interview all of Megan's family and friends to see if they knew anything that could really help them pin the blame on Megan. And they quickly learned that Megan and Walter had moved in together recently, and Jack did not approve. So Hoole began to wonder, maybe the young couple might have killed Jack so he would stay out of their way. Now, Megan at some point here found out from her friends who were being spoken to that clearly Megan was being investigated. And Megan had already called Hoole to revise her testimony. She was now claiming that actually the last time she saw her dad was on the night of the 26th, not the 27th. But Hoole didn't buy that she and Walter had both made the same mistake about the date. They both seemed really confident when they said 27th. And so Hoole was hoping that if he could just retrace Jack's steps on the day of his death, he'd find some proof that Megan and Walter were somehow involved. Hoole had already called around to check on the last scheduled job in Jack's logbook, which was on the morning of June 27th. And that client had confirmed that Jack was definitely there, and security footage from the local dump had shown Jack dropping off the trash afterwards around 2 p.m. But that left about a 3-hour gap on the afternoon of June 27th where Jack's whereabouts were unaccounted for. And really, Jack had to have been killed sometime in that window. So now Hoole hoped that Jack's phone records might help him figure out where Jack went after leaving the dump that afternoon. Hoole had been able to match most of the phone numbers that Jack dialed or received calls from to contacts in Jack's logbook, except for one. On the morning of June 27th, he had gotten a call from a number that wasn't anywhere in his contacts list. And at 2:07 that afternoon, while Jack was finishing up at the dump and just a few hours before his dead body was left in a Target parking lot, he'd gotten a second call from that same number. And so now, Hoole called that number, but it went straight to voicemail. So he called the cell provider and asked them to look up who this number belonged to. And he found out it was registered to a man named Charlie Waz. And suddenly, something clicked in Hoole's mind. And so he reached over and he grabbed Jack's logbook and he flipped to the page where Jack had scribbled down that address, 145 North Road, and also the name Charlie. This Charlie may be the same Charlie who called from that unknown number. And also, this Charlie may have been the last person to see Jack alive. Or maybe Charlie was the one who killed him. The cell provider employee also told Hoole that that number came from a prepaid phone, the kind you can buy at a convenience store and load minutes onto without signing up for a long-term contract, and that it had been activated on June 19th, just 8 days before Jack's murder. Hoole asked the worker to send over a full copy of the prepaid phone call's records, and then they hung up. Then Hoole logged onto the police database and looked up the name Charlie Waz, but he didn't find anything. No criminal records or driver's licenses or car registrations. And so Hoole had a feeling that this had to be a fake name, that there was no Charlie Waz. And what seemed to confirm that even further was when he looked up that address, the 145 North Road that was in the book next to the word Charlie. There was no Charlie affiliated with that property at all. The owner of 145 North Road was somebody called Michael Connors, but that name didn't mean anything to Hoole, and it certainly wasn't Charlie. So Hoole stood up from his desk and he grabbed his car keys. It was time to go talk with whoever actually lived at 145 North Road. Less than an hour later, Detective Hoole pulled onto a gravel driveway at 145 North Road, the address of the secluded farm scribbled in Jack Reed's logbook. He parked his car and he walked up to the big white house and he rang the doorbell. And the middle-aged man who answered the door seemed very calm and composed, until Hoole showed him his badge. Then the man started acting really jumpy. As they stood in the doorway, Hoole asked the man if he was Michael Connors, and the man nodded and said yes. Hoole asked if he knew a man named Jack Reed, and Michael quickly said no. And when Hoole asked why his address was in Jack Reed's logbook, Michael stammered out that he didn't know. It seemed fairly obvious to Hoole already that Michael clearly knew more than he was admitting to. And so he asked Michael where he'd been on the afternoon of June 27th. And Michael, very nervously and very quickly, said that he had spent all day doing repair work at a friend's lake house 30 miles away, and he didn't get home until late that night. And then he gave Hoole the names of a few other contractors who were also working on these repairs, who could verify his alibi. So Hoole, without giving off how suspicious he felt of this guy, wrote down the contractors' names and contact information, and then, as calm as could be, he asked Michael if he could take a look around, both inside his house and outside. Michael, who looked pretty resigned at this point, nodded and said yes, and then he stepped aside. And so Hoole walked into the house and began walking from room to room. But he didn't see any blood or anything really obviously suspicious. But then he went outside and he found this muddy path that led over to the barn, which was only a short distance from the main house. And when he reached the barn, he opened up the heavy wooden door, and sunlight flooded in. Hoole stepped inside, and right away he was struck by how neat it was in here. He began looking behind the hay bales, and he shined his flashlights in the corners, and he bent down to examine the dirt and the straw on the ground, but it was like the barn was spotless, almost like the barn had recently been cleaned really thoroughly. When Hoole was done in the barn, he went outside and walked back towards the main house. And as he did, he saw Michael standing by the back door, staring right at him, like he had been really watching him closely as he was over at the barn. And so Hoole walked over to Michael, and very calmly, he asked him one last question. Did he know anyone named Megan Reed? And Michael said no, but the way he said it was noticeably less anxious, as if, for really the first time, he was telling the truth here. After that, as Hoole walked back to his car to leave, he thought that even though he hadn't found any hard evidence at this farm, Michael's weird behavior seemed to be saying a lot. Later that day, Hoole hung up the phone in his office, feeling very frustrated. He called every single one of those contractors who Michael had given him, and they had all confirmed his alibi. Michael had been doing repairs at his friend's house, 30 miles away, at the time of Jack's death. So Hoole figured that, Michael couldn't have been directly involved in the murder, but based on his very suspicious behavior, it seemed like he probably knew something had happened on his property, maybe while he was away. And this gave Hoole something to work with, because it could mean that at least one of Jack's 3 or more killers was close enough with Michael that Michael was willing to lie to protect them. But that was about all he had to work with. There was no obvious link between Michael Connors and Jack's daughter Megan and her boyfriend Walter, who were still really his only real suspects. And so he was starting to think that maybe he'd been looking in the wrong direction, and that Megan and Walter maybe weren't involved after all. It was still only a few days into the investigation, and there were plenty of other potential suspects to dig into, like Jack's ex-partners and his adult children from his first relationship and all the other clients in his logbook. But just then, Hoole's fax machine whirred to life. The cell provider was finally sending over the call records from Charlie's prepaid phone. Once it was done printing, Hoole ripped the sheet out of the machine and began looking over the call log. The phone had only been activated a week before Jack's murder, and it hadn't been used at all since the evening Jack was killed. And every single call that had been made or received on that phone was to Jack's number, except for one. And when Hoole looked into the owner of that one other number, everything about the case began to fall into place. Based on those phone records, as well as interviews with the various suspects, this is what police believe happened to Jack Reed on June 27, 2005. That afternoon, while Jack's dump truck was pulling into the gravel driveway at 145 North Road, 2 of Jack's killers were inside of that house waiting for him. One of them was sitting on the couch, nervously tapping their feet, and then that killer looked up and saw their accomplice staring right at them, looking very annoyed, like, "Stop tapping your feet." And so they did. But just then, the doorbell rang. The calmer of the 2 killers walked over to answer it, while the more nervous one stayed on the couch. And the nervous one, they listened as the door opened, and they could hear the sound of their accomplice greeting Jack. And then a few seconds later, Jack walked into the living room. And the nervous killer, when they saw Jack, they kind of jumped to their feet and tried to act natural, but very likely they were acting incredibly nervous. But after a sort of awkward conversation between all 3 of them, they left the main house and they walked down that dirt path towards the barn. As they walked, the killer, who'd been very nervous, sort of hung back, walking a few steps behind Jack. And then as they got close to the barn, their heart began to pound, I mean, they'd rehearsed this a dozen times and they knew exactly what they had to do, but actually doing it was going to be the hard part. Then the doors to the barn opened up, and inside, Jack would have seen there were 2 more people waiting for him. But before Jack could react, the nervous killer leapt forward and tackled Jack to the ground. And then a second later, the nervous killer heard a loud thump and looked up to see one of their accomplices standing above them, holding a hammer that was now dripping with blood. The nervous killer climbed to their feet and looked down at Jack, who was now lying on the floor of the barn with a gaping hole in the side of his skull. It was so gruesome that the nervous killer had to go outside and vomit. And then when they came back inside, the other 3 had unrolled this big piece of plastic on the floor of the barn, and they were placing Jack's body in the center of it. Blood was still pouring out of his head, pooling into this big red puddle on the plastic. I mean, it was so awful. Then one of the killers grabbed the bloody hammer and said that if they could just stop Jack's heart, it would stop the bleeding. And so they raised the hammer and began pounding on Jack's chest. And after that, the bleeding did slow down, and the 4 killers worked together to wrap Jack's body in the plastic. Then, once he was all wrapped up, they carried him outside and loaded his body into the back of his own dump truck. The killer who had first answered the door, the calmer of the killers, got in the driver's seat of the dump truck. And the nervous killer, the one who had been tapping their foot, the one who had initially tackled Jack to the ground, they climbed into the passenger seat. The other 2, the ones who had been waiting in the barn, climbed into a minivan, and they followed behind them as they drove all the way across state lines to Saugus, Massachusetts, more than an hour away. When they finally got to Saugus, they pulled into the first major parking lot they came across, a Target store. They parked the dump truck near the back of the lot, and then when they got out, the nervous killer double-checked the tarp to make sure it was secure, and then they, along with their calmer accomplice, walked across the lot to the white minivan, and they climbed inside. After that, all 4 killers drove all the way back to New Hampshire to clean up the barn, because the farm's owner, Michael Connors, expected it to be left in perfect condition. Now, Michael Connors, the owner of the barn, was not directly involved in the murder scheme. However, he did know that the mastermind of the murder was going to be using his property while he was gone. However, he would testify that he did not know what they were doing and just asked that they keep it clean when he got back. Ultimately, the reason he allowed his property to be used at all is because he was doing a favor to the mastermind of the murder, who was his longtime friend and business partner, and also the very same self-made Las Vegas millionaire that Jack Reed himself had viewed as this big success story, whose path in life Jack was hoping to emulate. The millionaire's name was John Brooks, and he believed that when Jack had helped him move, it was a job he had done for him a few years back, that Jack, during that move, had stolen some of his motorcycles and jewelry. Now, there was no evidence to actually back this up, but John Brooks was convinced, and he held a grudge. So in retaliation, a few months after the move, Brooks had sent his son Jesse to Jack's home to scare him. That's who Jack had spotted in the middle of the night on his property almost 2 years ago, the strange prowler who had literally called out to Jack by name. But when Jack came outside to confront him and literally fired a gun at Jesse, Jesse and his dad did not stop what they were doing. Instead, Brooks only got angrier, and he vowed to get revenge. So he'd sent 4 people out to New Hampshire to kill Jack. It was his son Jesse, Jesse's friend Michael Benton, who was not the same as the Michael who owned the farm, and the 2 other men who were named Joseph Vrooman and Robin Knight. All 5 men were eventually convicted of taking part in the murder. John Brooks was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Robin Knight was also sentenced to life. Michael Benton, not Michael Connors, the owner of the barn, so Michael Benton got 33 years to life. Joseph Vrooman was sentenced to between 17 and 35 years, and Jesse Brooks was sentenced to 15 to 30 years. He was released on parole in 2023. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, MrBallen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen, produced by Jeremy Bone. This episode was written by Kate Gallagher. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Cole Lacasio. Additional audio editing by Jordan Stidham. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. And just a reminder, every new and exclusive episode we put out on the MrBallen podcast, you can also now watch on the MrBallen YouTube channel that very same day. And trust me, some of these stories you truly have to see to believe. Again, my YouTube channel is just called MrBallen. If you want to listen to episodes 1 week early and ad-free, you can subscribe to SiriusXM Podcast Plus on Apple Podcasts or visit SiriusXM.com/Podcast Plus to listen with Spotify or another app of your choice. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Today, we have two stories about people who have near-death experiences. And then after the initial trauma of the experience has passed, they're like, okay, I'm good now, I'm safe, everything's fine. But no, they were not okay, as they would soon learn. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the Follow Button's house and on their bathroom mirror, write, "I'm watching you" in red lipstick. Okay, let's get into our first story, which is called Crisis Averted, Crisis Created. On the morning of April 29th, 1963, a woman named Sofia Perez was riding in the passenger seat of her car, her husband Julian was driving, and they were traveling down a narrow city street in Sevilla, Spain. It was a Monday, but Julian, who was the primary breadwinner, he didn't have work that day. And so the couple had decided, since it was such a beautiful spring day as well, that they would get out and go on a nice drive and just spend some time together. And for Sofia, this was like a perfect day. She adored her husband, and she really loved the city of Sevilla. All the people there were so nice and friendly, and it was such a beautiful place that this was shaping up to be really a tremendous day. And so Sofia and her husband, they are all smiles as they continue driving down this road. Sofia, she's looking out, taking in the sights and the sounds, and then at some point, she just has this inclination to pull out her lipstick and, apply her lipstick. And so she reaches down and she grabs her purse, which she brought with her everywhere. She was a very organized person. And she opened it up and she's rifling through it and she finds her lipstick, and then she grabs the rear view mirror and she turns it and she uses it to apply the lipstick. And as she's doing this, she begins asking Julian, hey, what should we do for the rest of the day? Beyond this drive, what else should we do? And as she's sort of half looking at the mirror and half looking at Julian, she sees a blur of motion out in front of the car. And then she turns and she realizes there's someone in the intersection that they're going to hit. It's a guy on a motorcycle. And before she could say anything, Julian is swerving hard to the right to try to avoid this guy. It's absolute madness. And then the motorcyclist, he tips over and he goes into a slide. And then Julian and Sofia, they ram off the road onto the sidewalk and smash into this huge pole. And pretty much right away, Sofia, after the car had come to a stop in front of this huge, metal pole, Sofia began patting herself down to sort of assess the damage to make sure she was okay. And then she looked over at her husband, Julian, who was sort of doing the same thing, and they realized that, obviously despite the horribleness of this crash, that they were okay. But then their attention turned to the motorcyclist, because even though Julian didn't hit him, they narrowly missed him. He swerved away and they crashed into this pole. Despite that, one of the last things Sofia saw before they swerved is the motorcyclist had tipped over and gone into a skid, so they had no idea if he was okay or not. And so Sofia and Julian, they carefully climbed out of their pretty wrecked vehicle, and again, they stood and kind of checked to make sure they really were okay, because now they're standing for the first time, but they're okay. and they walked a little ways, across the street to this other sort of side street where the motorcyclist had skidded off to. And right over there, he was standing. The man who was on the motorcycle, he was standing next to his bike. And, obviously his bike had had some damage done to it, but the man, the motorcyclist, he looked unhurt as well. So this was like an enormous, in some ways, stroke of luck. Obviously, it was bad to get into the accident, but all three of them appeared to be okay. And so Sophia and Julian, they walk over to the motorcyclist, and, the three of them were really amicable. I mean, the motorcyclist understood that, accidents happen. Thank goodness nobody was hurt. And just for a few minutes, the three of them just chatted and sort of just talked about how lucky they really were here. And they exchanged information, so they could cover the damages if they needed to of the respective vehicles. And as they're just sitting there having this, relatively calm and just normal conversation here, Sophia looks over at Julian and she realizes, he was basically unhurt, but not entirely unhurt. He had this scratch on his face that was bleeding a fair amount that very likely was from the crash. And even though by no means is this like life-threatening or anything like that, Sophia was not at the moment talking to the motorcyclist. And so she figured she would just go back over to the car and grab her purse because she's very organized and she has something in that purse for every situation. She figured she very likely had like a bandage or something she could use to clean up her husband's cut. And so she told her husband and the motorcyclist she was gonna go get a purse and go grab a bandage or something. She goes over to the car, which is still smashed up on the side of the road, of course, and there's a little bit of a crowd of people sort of relatively nearby, kind of assessing the scene. She makes her way around towards the passenger side because her purse was still in the car in the passenger seat. And as she was coming around, getting ready to reach through the open door to grab her purse, which was sitting right there on the seat, something happened. Like she got close enough to the car where like suddenly she felt this intense pain all through her body. And then it was like she couldn't even move. And she found herself falling towards the ground, looking up at the sky, and like her muscles are beginning to spasm. And the last thing she saw was her husband and the motorcyclist running over to her. And then to her horror, as she's laying there looking up at them, they too began to sort of seize up and spasm and fall to the ground right next to her. It would turn out that when Julian swerved to avoid that motorcyclist and crashed into that pole, neither he nor Sophia realized that that pole was actually connected to a power line that held up electrical lines carrying a huge amount of electrical voltage. And during the crash, a few of those lines from the pole had been knocked down to the ground and they fell around Sophia and Julian's car. When the couple first got out of the vehicle, they sort of miraculously avoided stepping on those lines. And if they had just stayed over there, with the motorcyclist and just hadn't gone back to the vehicle, they would have been fine. But Sophia, whose purse always had exactly what she needed, was in the car and she wanted to get it and get that bandage. And so when she went back, she stepped on one of those lines and she was electrocuted. And so she's on the ground, she can't move. And her husband and the motorcyclist, they see this happening, they hear it happening, and they run over unaware of the danger. And they too are hit by those electrical lines. They fall to the ground and all three were electrocuted to death. Our second and final story today is called Rock Bottom. On January 11th, 2018, around 10 a.m., 55-year-old Ray Wright sawed through a wooden board inside of his workshop, which was located about 20 minutes outside of Rockland, California. Now, Ray had only just begun his workday, but he was already covered in sawdust. However, he barely noticed, because this was just a normal part of his job as a carpenter, something he absolutely loved. He loved his career. In fact, Ray really just sort of loved everything about his life and sort of how it was going these days. And that had not always been the case. So about 6 years earlier, Ray was in a very different and much worse place in his life. He'd been recently divorced and had started drinking a lot, and he'd spiraled, further and further out of control until one night he'd gotten really drunk and then hopped behind the wheel, and he caused a terrible accident when he crashed head-on into another vehicle. Now, Ray was more or less okay after that crash, but he'd actually severely injured the people in the car that he had hit. And so Ray had been arrested and sentenced to 18 months in prison, and he was ordered to pay a huge monetary settlement to the victims of this crash. And so really, this had been like the true rock bottom moment of Ray's life. But by the time Ray actually got out of jail, he was determined to really turn his life around and become a better person. He'd stopped drinking, and he had joined Alcoholics Anonymous, which is a very well-known support group that helps keep people sober. He'd started spending way more time with his 3 kids and also his brother Dean, and he'd been renting this particular workshop that he was in right now to revamp his carpentry business, Ray Wright Design. And then also, in addition to these specific behavioral changes, overall, Ray had made this huge effort to really shift his thinking about the way he approached life. He decided he was gonna really try hard to just have a much more positive attitude in general and just try to be happier. He believed it was more of a mindset, and he really was trying hard to stay in that positive, happy mindset. However, despite these wholesale changes in Ray's behavior and his mindset, which were definitely all good, the one thing he was up against that was very difficult to change, since coming out of prison, was his financial situation. I mean, he really just didn't make a whole lot of money, despite working really hard as a carpenter now. He just didn't make a lot of money. And this really didn't just affect his life, it affected other people's lives as well. Because, he needed to make those huge settlement payments to the victims of the crash, which he intended to do. But so far, he had not made enough money to make those payments, and it was definitely stressing him out. He knew he needed to make those payments, but Ray was sort of determined that he would just continue to work really hard, continue to build up his business, continue to stay positive, stay happy, be a good person, and eventually he was sure to make these payments and everything would be okay. So in essence, Ray still had problems, but he was working really hard to just stay on the straight and narrow and do the right thing. Now, Ray blew some of the sawdust off the board that he had just cut, and he set it aside. And then, as he was about to start on the next thing, he realized one of the tools that he needed was out in his truck. So he walked through the shop's big warehouse-style doors that opened out onto a dirt driveway. So the workshop where Ray worked was in a fairly rural area with only one immediate neighbor who lived in a trailer right next door on the same property. And the person who owned the trailer was a woman named Katie. But, despite there only being Katie next door, there was still a fair amount of people just sort of coming and going around the place, like Katie's friends and Ray's clients. So the area was actually usually pretty lively. But this morning, as he stepped outside onto the driveway, it was pretty quiet. So Ray just made his way out to his truck and grabbed what he needed from inside, and then he turned and began walking back towards the shop. However, before he actually got to the shop, he heard footsteps on the driveway right behind him. 2 days later, Ray's brother Dean drove his car through some back roads as he made his way towards Ray's house in Rockland, California. Dean had just been to Ray's workshop, and now he was making the 20-minute drive back to Ray's home yet again. And the reason he was doing that is because Dean was really worried. He hadn't heard from his brother in 2 days, and neither had Ray's kids or any of Ray's friends. And this was very unusual. Dean, himself talked to Ray every single day. And he also knew that Ray was a very involved and responsive dad who would definitely not just disappear on his kids. And he was also definitely in touch with other friends. I mean, this was just very unusual for Ray. So over the past 48 hours, Dean had been increasingly getting more and more worried about Ray. He had been talking to anyone he could to try to figure out why his brother was just suddenly gone. He'd already gone to Ray's workshop and his house repeatedly, and he hadn't found Ray or any sign of Ray or any sign of where he might have gone. And also Ray's truck was nowhere to be found either. And that was actually particularly concerning because, deep down, Dean was worried that, despite the changes Ray had made in his life to be a better person and to do right by people, he was worried that, maybe Ray had fallen off the wagon and was drinking again. Maybe that's why he's gone. He's on a bender somewhere. Now, Dean really didn't want to face that reality. That would be devastating for so many reasons, not to mention, if Ray was off drinking somewhere, who knows what trouble he could be in. He could be in a lot of trouble or hurt or something. And so Dean, by this point, 48 hours into his brother's disappearance, he's just doing his best to kind of push down this growing concern that maybe that's what happened. And in fact, it was actually that sort of nagging fear that Dean had kept him from going to the police and reporting Ray missing. There was just this fear that if he did that, it would sort of expose Ray if he was, not doing what he was supposed to be doing. And so By this point, Dean had held off. Now, Dean parked his car outside of Ray's house again, and he got out, and, Ray's truck was not back yet. But Dean was determined that he would just go back inside and take another look around to see if maybe he had missed something. Maybe there was some clue as to where, Ray went or what he was up to. So Dean walked up to his brother's front door and he let himself inside, and immediately Dean stopped because he smelled something. It smelled like marijuana smoke inside the house, which was really, really odd. I mean, one, because the last time he was here, he definitely did not smell marijuana smoke, but more than that, Ray, his brother, had definitely once been a very heavy drinker, that was true. But he had always hated marijuana, like he did not smoke marijuana. And so Dean's standing in the doorway trying to make sense of this, when from the other side of the room, he hears somebody shouting at him to leave. And he sees on the other side of the room, this man has suddenly popped up who Dean did not know, who was looking right at him, basically gesturing for Dean to get out of the house. But Dean, he's sort of like, what's going on here? He looks at this guy and he's like, who are you? Like, what are you doing in here? And the guy went very quickly from being sort of demanding to Dean to very spooked, turning and sprinting out the door, out of sight. Within the hour, a police officer with the Rockland Police Department pulled his cruiser up outside of a small one-story home in Rockland and parked. He saw a man waiting outside the garage, and as the officer got out of his car, the man rushed up and introduced himself as Dean, the person who had called 911. Dean explained to the officer that he had just seen an intruder here inside of his brother's home, and that his brother was also missing. And so the officer took down some notes, both about the intruder and also about, Dean's brother's absence and why him being gone for 2 days was really out of character. And so after the officer finished speaking to Dean, he went inside of Ray's house to take a look around and see if, there was any evidence left behind by the intruder to indicate who they were, or if there was any evidence about, where Ray was, and maybe that this intruder had something to do with Ray's absence. But once inside the home, the officer saw there was no sign of forced entry or any kind of mess or violence, so it didn't immediately seem like the intruder had robbed the place or gotten into some kind of physical fight with its owner. But still, the officer left the property and went back to his cruiser and called it in. And so over the next few days, the Rockland Police Department sort of led 2 parallel investigations. There was the investigation into this intruder inside of Ray's home, which really wasn't going very far. They had very little evidence. There was barely a description of this guy from Dean, who did not get a good look at him. And then the other investigation was into Ray's disappearance. And there was definitely some thinking that the intruder and Ray's disappearance could be connected, but as of right now, they didn't know. But with regards to Ray's disappearance, after the police had spoken to Ray's family and friends, they determined that no one had seen or spoken to him since January 11th. That was like the first sort of hard date and hard fact that they had. They also checked into Ray's bank account and phone activity, and they learned he hadn't used them since January 11th, when apparently he went missing. But beyond those details, like as the weeks went on, really nothing else came in, not about the intruder or about Ray. Then on January 21st, so 10 days after Ray went missing, the Rockland Police Department got their first, big new lead. And that was Ray's truck had been found. He was not in it. It had been found totally abandoned in this apartment complex that was not far from his workshop. A couple of months later, on an afternoon in late March, Rockland Police Sergeant Zach Lewis sat at his desk at the station going over Ray's case file for what he felt like was the millionth time. So since finding Ray's truck, basically no new leads had come in. And even that, the finding of Ray's truck really had not been the break that the police had really hoped it would be. The truck was basically in decent working condition. The only thing that really stood out was the plates had been taken off of it. But after they searched the truck extensively, they basically didn't find anything. Nothing that gave away what happened to Ray or where he was or, whether or not this intruder had something to do with Ray. Like, it just really didn't go anywhere. So Sergeant Lewis was feeling pretty stuck when it came to this case. And so right now he was just looking through the information they already had on this case to see if maybe he had missed something. However, as he began doing this, another officer ran through the station towards his desk, waving around some sheets of paper. And this officer ran right up to Lewis, and he slammed the papers down on his desk and explained that the California Highway Patrol had just sent a report over because they thought it might contain a lead in Ray's case. And here was the lead. And so Lewis is really excited. He grabs the document and he sees it's a report. And it's about this van that had gotten in an accident at the end of January, a few miles south of Rocklin in Sacramento. The driver of this van had been extremely drunk and was going over 100 miles an hour when he crashed. And somewhat miraculously, nobody got hurt, including the driver. And so the driver, he survives, and now he's facing like all these charges of drunk driving and reckless driving. But the reason this report was sent over to Rocklin was because the driver was a man named Victor Gray. That's what his license said. So after the crash, the police discovered that the license plate on the van that Victor had been driving was definitely the right license plate. However, the registration stickers that were on the license plates were not the right ones. Basically, Victor or somebody had taken stickers from some other vehicle and put them on this van's plates to give the impression that their vehicle, this van, was registered. But when they tracked those registration stickers, they discovered those stickers actually belonged to Ray Wright's abandoned truck. Now, Rocklin's police department knew this was a huge lead, and they could not screw it up. And so they wanted to make sure that they handled, whatever they did next exactly right, and they leveraged whatever resources they could get. So, over the next few weeks, Lewis and his team reached out to the FBI to help them process Victor's van and collect any potential evidence that was associated with Ray's disappearance. And a little over a month later, on May 8th, 2018, Lewis stood with a few of his other officers in a parking lot not far from Rocklin, watching as a team of FBI agents searched Victor's van. Now, by this point, they had discovered that this van not only had Ray's registration stickers on it, but also inside of the van was a lot of Ray's stuff. They had found Ray's glasses, which were smashed. They had found Ray's cell phone, which was also smashed. They found his wallet. They found a hat that said Ray Wright Design on it. And critically, they found Ray's rain jacket, and it was covered in blood and partially charred, like it had been burned. And so at this point, it seemed fairly obvious to investigators that Ray was not just missing. He didn't just, go off the wagon and start drinking again and go disappear somewhere. No. He very likely had been killed, and very likely this guy Victor Gray had something to do with it. But the problem was there was no obvious connection between Victor Gray and Ray Wright, like they were total strangers. And when they tried to speak to Victor, to interrogate him, to try to get him to open up and explain if he had something to do with this, if he knew who Ray was, Victor was not talking, so that was a total dead end. And so now investigators were just hoping that, whatever evidence they found in this van, that once it was, sent off and analyzed, that hopefully that would sort of maybe begin to explain what actually happened here. Was this just a random robbery gone wrong? Victor was just robbing Ray and it got violent? Or was it something else? Or who knows what? They just didn't know. Now, Lewis watched as the FBI agents wrapped up the search of the van and they began packing things up, so it was clear they had sort of pulled all the evidence they were going to pull. And, Sergeant Lewis and his team, they were about to leave when suddenly one of the FBI agents who was searching the front of the van in the front two seats, he began waving his arm like he had found something. And so Lewis and the others, they go running over and they look inside the van, and this agent is pointing down to like the center of the front of this van, basically near the center console. And there was this little space underneath the center console that apparently nobody had looked in yet. And inside of this little space was another cell phone. 5 months later, on an afternoon in October, Lewis pulled his cruiser into the dirt driveway right outside of Ray's workshop. But when Lewis and the other detective that he was with got out of their car, they ran past Ray's workshop and went to the trailer next door, where Lewis knew a woman named Katie Barnard lived. And so Lewis stood back as the other detective knocked on the door of the trailer, and a few seconds later, a very timid-looking woman, Katie, came to the door and she asked what was going on. And when Lewis explained to her why they were there, Katie went from looking timid to looking downright terrified. And she just began to shake, like she clearly understood why they were here. So they took her down to the station, and pretty much as soon as she was sitting inside of an interrogation room and they began asking her questions, Katie just completely broke and told them everything she knew. So ever since Ray got out of prison for that drunk driving accident, he really had been single-mindedly focused on trying to be a better person and not letting his rock bottom moment sort of ruin his life. And he'd done a great job doing that. He'd gotten sober, he'd begun, spending much more time with his family. He was like a very present father now. He was very well liked in the community. However, even though Ray, had good intentions here, the reality was he was just sort of focusing on rebuilding his own life. He wasn't really trying to help other people. Like his post-jail efforts were sort of all about him. And his self-improvement journey had really not been beneficial for everyone, because Ray had really not truly atoned or done right by the person he had hurt the most, one of the victims of his drunk driving accident, a man named Bob Manor. Bob had been absolutely furious with Ray after the accident because the accident had severely injured him, Bob, to the point where Bob had a permanent limp. And then Ray had stopped making those court-mandated settlement payments to Bob. He was supposed to, but he just wasn't making them. And so Bob is like incensed. It's like, how dare you? You hurt me, you hurt my family, and you're not even paying for it. Like, jail isn't enough. And so for Bob, it became like an obsession that he really wanted to get his revenge on Ray. And it just so happened that Bob was not just a guy with a grudge. Bob was a very violent drug dealer as well. So this was a really big deal for him. So basically, after Ray got out of prison, Bob began obsessing over where Ray was. Like, he wanted to literally discover his address so he could physically go and take his revenge, but he couldn't find Ray. He could not find the information. No one was going to give it to him, for this reason exactly. And so he was just furious all the time. He wants to find Ray, but he has no way of knowing where he lives. Then, just by pure happenstance, Bob ends up dating a woman named Katie Barnard, who just so happens to live in the trailer right next door to the shop in Rockland, California, where Ray worked. And, Bob had no idea. He's just over visiting with Katie all the time. And one day he looks out the window, and who does he see walking out of the doors of that shop? Ray Wright. After that, and you have to understand that some of this stuff actually was never fully explained, Bob hired a man named Victor Gray to kidnap Ray for him, because he wasn't going to do it himself. He needed to catch Ray off guard. And so Victor Gray kidnaps Ray, and he apparently brings Ray to Bob so that Bob can exact his revenge on Ray. Now, we don't know exactly what happened once Bob potentially received Ray. We don't know if Ray ever actually made it to Bob, but we do know at some point Victor did kidnap Ray, and there was definitely revenge, on the agenda. But what Bob ultimately failed to do, that got him caught and got Victor caught and got this whole thing blown up, was he didn't pay Victor for the kidnapping. So the very thing that Bob was so mad about really was like, how dare Ray do this to me and then not pay me? Well, Bob did the same thing to Victor. He didn't pay him. And Victor was also a violent person. He's a convicted felon, and he didn't take that lightly. And so what did he do? He wrote a letter to Bob, basically being like, hey, I kidnapped this guy for you, and I handed him to you. Like, I handed him over, and you haven't paid me yet. And then he took pictures of this letter, and those pictures were on that phone that was found underneath the center console of Victor Gray's van. Those pictures of this letter are what connected Victor to Bob, and then the connection from Bob to Ray was already known. And then also critically, because Victor hadn't been paid by Bob for this kidnapping, he took the liberty of not only kidnapping Ray, but he went back and stole the registration stickers off of Ray's truck, and he put them on his own van. And then ultimately, it was that led to Victor getting caught and this whole, con being exposed. Now, we actually don't know specifically what happened to Ray Wright. All we know is that he definitely was kidnapped, and that Bob ordered the kidnapping, and that realistically, Bob is a pretty violent guy. Victor's a violent guy. There's blood found all over, Ray's stuff. It seemed pretty apparent that the revenge that was exacted on Ray involved his murder. But Ray's body was never found, and so we don't really know what happened to him. However, using overwhelming circumstantial evidence, both Bob Manor and Victor Gray were both convicted of first-degree murder and kidnapping, and they were sentenced to life in prison without parole. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, MrBallen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen, produced by Jeremy Bone and Cole Acasio. This episode was written by Kate Murdoch. Story editing by Evan Allen. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, Camille Callahan, Alex Paul, Ben Fasciano. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Jordan Stidham. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song, Something Wicked, by Ross Bugden. Our two stories today are both about people who believed in something so strongly that it informed every single choice they made. And unfortunately for them, those choices led them down very dangerous paths. But before we get into today's two stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, the next time the follow button sneezes in public, instead of, politely saying, bless you, just scream, shut up! Okay, let's get into our first story called The Search for Akakor. One afternoon in November of 1980, 28-year-old John Reed sat at a table on a hotel veranda in the tiny village of Barcelos, Brazil, which was a 2-day boat ride up a river from the Amazon jungle's largest city of Manaus. And sitting across from John was the legendary chief of the Uga Mongolula tribe, Tatunka Nara. Now, John had been in Barcelos for about 10 days now, and in that time, he'd already spoken to Tatunka many times. But still, it was like every conversation they had gave John this incredible sense of awe. He really felt like his whole life had been leading up to this exact moment of being here in Barcelos, about to go on this grand adventure. So Barcelos and Tatunka were very far away from where John had grown up. I mean, this was a very foreign place. John grew up in San Francisco, California. But even growing up in those suburbs as a kid, he had always dreamed of coming here and literally meeting Tatunka. So it was like surreal he had really done this. And if things from here on out went the way John hoped they would, he might never have to even go back to America. Because John was on a bona fide quest. John was in Barcelos to be the person who finally found the long-lost city of Akakor. Now, there was almost no record of the city ever actually existing, except for in one book called The Chronicle of Akakor, which was by this author and journalist named Carl Brugger. Carl wrote that Akakor was the capital city of a 12,000-year-old civilization, similar to the Incas or ancient Egyptians, in that they'd lived thousands of years ago and had a big empire and an extremely advanced civilization for their time. But according to Carl, Akakor and its people were way better because they were descendants from actual gods. When the Europeans eventually came to the Amazonian jungle, the people of Akakor did not get wiped out because they went underground. And it was there, underground, that they rebuilt their capital and literally hid their civilization from the modern world. And in fact, the legend said that they actually still live there now, guarding a treasure that had been given to them by the gods. Now, most people called Carl's book complete fiction and said that its author just sort of made it up to make money. But John hadn't paid any attention to the naysayers, and any possible doubts that he had had completely disappeared the moment he'd finally met Tatunka. So Tatunka was not only a famous chief who knew the Amazon like the back of his hand, but more importantly, at least to John, he'd actually been interviewed in Carl's book, and he was said to be the one known person who'd actually been to Akakor who was still alive. And here Tatunka was, in the flesh, sitting across the table from John in all his Amazonian glory. He wore just a loincloth, and he had that same turtle tattoo that the book described, so John knew he was the guy, he was the chief he'd been looking for. And to John, if Tatunka was real, well then surely everything else in that book was real too. Right now though, neither John nor Tatunka were saying anything, which was unusual because normally their meetings were very animated, as Tatunka regaled John with all these amazing stories about Akakor and what it was like there in his very heavily accented English. But hearing these stories hadn't been enough for John, who really wanted to know where Akakor actually was so that he could actually see it with his own eyes. Now, so far, Tatunka had not told John where it was. He'd said that the people of Akakor wanted to stay hidden, their survival depended on it, and so he was not going to give up their location. But today, John could feel that something was different, because just a few minutes ago, John had asked Tatunka again about literally going to Akakor, and now Tatunka had been very quiet for a very long time, like he was thinking about whether or not to finally reveal its location. And so John patiently waited. And as he sat there in this really intense silence, it was like he could almost feel Tatunka's deep wisdom oozing off of him in waves. And then finally, in his soft, very fragmented English, Tatunka began to speak. Almost 9 years later, on an evening in the spring of 1989, John's sister, 35-year-old Sandy Reed, pulled into the driveway of her San Francisco area home and got out of her car to check the mailbox. Sandy had just gotten back from her sales job, and she was tired and bleary-eyed as she, reached into the box and sort of mindlessly pulled out a stack of mail. But as she began sorting through the mail, the return address on one of the envelopes made her stop. It was a letter that was postmarked from Germany, and Sandy didn't know anybody who lived in Germany. And so she really wasn't sure what to expect as she quickly ripped it open. But as her eyes scanned the lines on the page, her hands began to shake uncontrollably. The letter was from a German detective who said that he was writing about her brother, John, and that they were sure something bad had happened to him. So John, Sandy's brother, had gone to Brazil almost a decade earlier to find the lost civilization of Akakor, and Sandy and her parents hadn't heard from him since he left. Now, during the first few weeks of John's trip, he'd written letters fairly regularly, but then his last message had come in late 1980, and after that, nothing. Now, of course, Sandy had been worried about her brother, but she also hadn't been that surprised he had gone radio silent, because Sandy and her parents were well aware that John was obsessed with Akakor, and not just that, he wanted to go on this adventure, find this lost city in the jungle, and then never come home. He wanted to stay in the jungle. And so they kind of figured that, maybe he found Akakor, or maybe he just found another village somewhere. But either way, the way they looked at it is John likely wanted to start a new life somewhere else, somewhere in the jungle, and that's probably what he had done. So for nearly a decade, that sort of became their line of thinking. But now, as Sandy is reading this letter, it was like suddenly her understanding of what was going on with her brother was totally and instantly fractured. Now she was both panicked and also totally confused about the idea that, one, John was in trouble, and two, why is the German police looking for her brother? Why is that happening? Why aren't American police looking for my brother? But as her eyes frantically scanned the page, she learned why. The detective said they were investigating the death or disappearance of John and at least 3 other people, including a German citizen, who apparently had been lured into the Amazon by a particular book about a place called Akakor. Now, this book, according to the detective, was complete junk. It was a fabrication. Akakor, not a real place. But the detective believed that someone was killing the people who came looking for it. Now, the detective said they had tried to investigate, but the Brazilian officials were being very uncooperative, and he wasn't actually allowed to go to Brazil to collect evidence to try to figure out what happened here. And so basically, he was stuck, but he wanted her to know they were looking into her brother. And so by the time Sandy finished reading this letter, she felt like, well, I have to do something. If the German police, if they can't go to Brazil, maybe I can. Sure enough, later that same year, in June, Sandy arrived in the city of Manaus in the Amazon and checked into her hotel. She knew from John's letters from 10 years ago before he disappeared that this was the general area he had been. And so her plan was, sort of roughly speaking, to search the city, turn it upside down, and see what she could learn. Now, obviously, this was a big undertaking. Manaus is a big place. But Sandy, at this point, was all in on this mission. Sandy didn't really know why. For 10 years, basically, she had no idea what happened to John. But it was like now, she felt like she was being called to do whatever she had to do to go find her brother. So she had quit her sales job, emptied her savings account, bought a flight here, and brought along a tape recorder, like an audio tape recorder, so that she would basically, not miss anything, talk to everybody and learn whatever she could and track it. And her plan basically was to just spend all her time interviewing locals, recording what they say, to try to figure out if anybody knew about John or Akakor. But almost as soon as she actually began doing this on the ground in Manaus, she realized how hard it was going to be. It had been almost a decade since her brother had gone missing. So when she met with the Brazilian law enforcement, they had virtually no details about his disappearance and really couldn't tell her anything useful. And when Sandy spoke to local residents, all she heard were endless rumors with no actual evidence. And on top of that, all the rumors she heard sort of contradicted each other. Some said a white man matching John's description had just recently been seen on the outskirts of Manaus. But then another person claimed John had been shot years ago and his bones had been found deep in the jungle. And then yet another person said, nope, none of that's true. What really happened is John found a tribe in the Amazon, not the people of Akakor, but another tribe, and he had decided to just live with them. Now, even though all this information she was getting was sort of all over the place, there still was one common reaction that almost everybody Sandy spoke to had: fear. Each time Sandy asked about Akakor, people would sort of clam up, like they were scared of it. Now, they all clearly knew about it, and most of the time when she brought it up, she was warned to sort of leave it alone, like don't talk about that. And that in some ways, looking for Akakor could get her in trouble or even killed. So as the days wore on, Sandy just felt herself feeling more and more confused and anxious. And each night, as she laid in her hotel bed, she wondered if she should just give up, that this was impossible. But then it was like every night after she'd drift off to sleep, she would have a dream about John. It was like he was haunting her. And he would say to her in these dreams that Akakor was not what he thought it would be. So just about every morning when she woke up, she'd have this sort of refound sense of purpose, and she would continue to look for her brother. But it just kept going nowhere. However, during her last few days in Manaus, based basically on finances, like she was running out of money and would have to go home soon, during that time period, she heard another rumor. And that was that John had gone into the jungle to find Akakor, but he hadn't gone in there blind. A local chief named Tatunka had told John how to get there. Now, by this point, Sandy had spent 3 weeks in Manaus and its surrounding areas and really felt completely overwhelmed. She really hadn't made much progress anywhere. There was definitely a sense of fear around Akakor, and she was even starting to feel that like looking into this could potentially get her into trouble. And in many ways, hearing about this new person, Tatunka, whether they were real or not, it actually made her scared. She would love to learn what he knew, to go find Tatunka and see if he knew where her brother was. But there was also a part of her that just feared even pursuing this lead. It was like all of a sudden, Brazil just felt too overwhelming for her. And so after learning about Tatunka, Sandy's reaction was actually to pack up and leave. But after leaving Brazil, Sandy did not just, fly to California and give up on the search for her brother. She just decided to look for her brother sort of in a roundabout way. She had heard from a local in Brazil that there was a Swiss tourist who might have seen John in the jungle. And so after Sandy left Brazil, she went to Switzerland and spoke to this tourist. And then after speaking with that tourist, she flew to Germany and she met with that detective who had sent her the initial letter she got. But neither the tourist nor the German detective had any new information. So by the end of all that, Sandy still had no answers. And by this point, she also had no money. She had completely drained her savings account trying to find her brother, and it had not worked. Now, Sandy considered just going home. I mean, she was broke, she was scared, and really she hadn't actually gotten anywhere in her search for her brother. But there was still one lead that she had not investigated, and that was Tatunka, because basically it just felt too scary. She'd abandoned it and left for Switzerland and Germany. But Sandy felt like now, if she never went back to Brazil to speak with him, she would never get any real answers. It felt like Tatunka was the key, and she had been cowardly. She needed to go back there. She needed closure. So she went back to America, but she only stayed long enough to earn some quick cash cleaning houses so that she could finance another trip to Brazil. On June 21st, 1990, so about a year after she had made her first trip, Sandy did return to Brazil. She took a small plane to the village of Barcelos, which she had learned was where Tatunka lived. This time, though, she brought some backup with her, a documentary producer and also a reporter. She felt a lot safer coming here with a group, but also she did want to draw attention and resources to eventually help her with her brother's case. When they landed at the rundown airport, Sandy and her small team deboarded and walked straight into the tiny village. In the time that she had been back in America earning cash, Sandy had done some research on Barcelos, so she knew by now that Karl Brugger's book, The Chronicle of Akakor, the book that, John had been so interested in that led him on this quest, had really spawned an entire economy in Barcelos, since tourists came to talk to Tatunka and to try to find it. He was in Barcelos. But as far as Sandy could tell, the tourist boom had not done much for the village of Barcelos. It was dirty and the houses were all very rundown shacks. She'd read that only about 3,000 people lived there, and between all of them, they only had one phone. And so as the group wandered around looking for a friendly face to give them directions, Sandy spotted a woman who was hanging her laundry up on a line outside her home. So Sandy approached her and asked if she knew where Tatunka lived. And the woman immediately nodded, which Sandy expected, because Sandy had not just read up on Barcelos. She now knew a lot about Tatunka as well. And she knew that basically everybody in this area knew his name. He was a renowned chief who'd once led an expedition for the famous explorer Jacques Cousteau. And he was a hero too. One time he had saved the lives of a dozen Brazilian soldiers after their plane had crashed in the Amazon. So the country's secret service was actually in Tatunka's debt. And also, of course, Tatunka was interviewed extensively in The Chronicle of Akakor, that book, and was the only known person who'd actually been to the city and knew its location. But more recently, Tatunka had settled into a quieter life and was running a hotel and giving boat tours to visitors along the Rio Negro. And so Sandy got directions to Tatunka's hotel from this woman, and as Sandy and her team began heading deeper into the village to go meet this guy, Sandy felt a mix of excitement and also fear. I mean, there was just something sort of heavy about finally meeting this guy. Eventually, the group came to what appeared to be a very isolated-looking hotel surrounded by a wooden gate. And inside of the gated area, up on the veranda of this hotel, was this very lean, shirtless man with a turtle tattooed on his chest. And Sandy knew immediately from the tattoo that that was Tatunka. As Sandy and her crew opened the gate and walked towards Tatunka, she pulled out a photo of her brother and held it up, along with an explanation of why she was there. And Tatunka at first just kind of listened and watched as they approached him, but then as he began to hear what she was saying, he smiled, and in broken English, he told Sandy he was surprised she hadn't come sooner. But Sandy didn't return his smile, because as she stared at Tatunka, all she could think of was how wrong everything was. Tatunka's face, the way he spoke, the way he carried himself, none of it made any sense at all. It would turn out those dreams Sandy was having where her brother John would appear to her and tell her that, Akakor was not like he thought it would be, it would turn out that was correct. Akakor didn't exist. However, it was not just a fake city created by that author, Karl Brugger, to sell his book. No, it was something much, much weirder than that. That whole book was based almost exclusively on the stories of Tatunka, the legendary Amazonian chief who Sandy was now meeting, in front of this weird hotel. But Tatunka, the man standing in front of Sandy, was not chief of anything. In fact, he wasn't even Amazonian. In reality, this man parading around as Tatunka was just some random German man named Gunther Hawk, who had fled Germany for the Amazon to avoid paying child support to his ex-wife in the 1960s. But when he arrived in the Amazon, he wanted to blend in, but he didn't speak the language, and he had this heavy German accent. So what do? Well, he created a whole made-up story about a long-lost civilization that he supposedly descended from, Akakor. The Akakor story was designed by this guy just to keep him from having to pay child support. The problem was, the Akakor story, the legend he created, worked too well. Gunther managed to convince local and even national authorities that he was an actual indigenous person. And then, fatefully, he also convinced this writer, Karl Brugger, that he really was from this lost civilization and sort of inadvertently created an entire tourism industry based on Akakor. And so when Karl's book came out, Gunther found himself in a bind. To keep his tourist revenue stream afloat, he had to keep pretending that Akakor was real and he knew where it was, while also never letting anybody get there. And both Sandy and the German police believe that to protect this secret, Gunther killed any tourists who insisted on actually visiting Akakor, including Sandy's brother, John Reed. Gunther Hawk has never been charged with murder and denies ever hurting anyone. John Reed's body was never found. The author, Karl Brugger, was shot to death in 1984 in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, and rumors still circulate about who killed him and why. And as of 2024, Gunther Hawk was confirmed to be alive and still living in Barcelos, and still insisting that Akakor is real. To this day, explorers still travel to Barcelos to try and find it. The second and final story for this episode is called The Parable. On the night of November 14th, 1994, 56-year-old DeWitt Finley drove his pickup truck up a snowy single-lane highway in the Oregon mountains. It was late, but DeWitt was incredibly alert, and it was taking every ounce of his concentration to not crash. It was snowing really, really hard, and the road was incredibly icy. Not to mention, DeWitt was towing a camper van behind his truck, and the van was sort of sliding around and causing DeWitt to feel really unbalanced as he drove. And so as he's driving along, white-knuckling here, all he could think about was how having taken this route was such a bad idea. So DeWitt was a traveling salesman, and he sold fancy camper vans, which was why he had one on the back of his truck, to drive it around from city to city and to show it off to potential new customers. He'd just been in the Oregon coastal town of Coos Bay and was now driving to Grants Pass, which was in the southern part of the state. Now, the drive should have only taken about 2.5 hours, but DeWitt had decided to take a longer, more scenic route that cut through the mountainous national forest. Except that now, instead of experiencing a tranquil, peaceful drive with lush, stunning Oregon scenery, he was stuck in a snowstorm and fighting his way up a steep, heavily forested slope with a cliff on one side. Now, for just about anybody, this would be a harrowing experience. But for DeWitt, he was especially out of his element. He was from sunny Los Angeles, California. He never drove in conditions like this. And he had only very recently moved to Montana this past summer with his fiancée and 2 kids. And while Montana did have some harsh winters, he hadn't experienced them yet. So this was really a novel experience. But DeWitt was a very religious man. And so as this drive was spiking his heart rate and making him so stressed out, he's white-knuckling his way up this pass, all he began to do was just quietly, internally pray. And for a time, this all seemed to work. Maybe the prayer was working. He was staying on the road. He was making his way. He thought, I'm going to get through this. But eventually, the truck began to slide on the slippery conditions, and DeWitt sort of panicked and hit the brakes as hard as he could, which caused the vehicle to slide even more. And then the next few seconds were just a blur of snow and darkness and trees. And then after what felt like an eternity, where he's thinking, oh my God, I'm going to go off the cliff, his truck slammed into a snowbank, keeping him from falling off the cliff. After that, everything went quiet and still. And for a moment, DeWitt just sat there, completely stunned. His heart was hammering in his chest and his whole body was vibrating with adrenaline. But after a few minutes, DeWitt calmed down enough that he was able to kind of assess the situation. Number one, he didn't go off the cliff. So that was a huge win. He survived. And then he checked himself out, and amazingly, he didn't appear to have any injuries. And also, from the inside, it seemed like his truck was okay too. I mean, maybe he dinged up the outside, from hitting the snowbank, but it just seems like he slid off the road and he was basically okay. To DeWitt, this felt like a miracle. He immediately felt like all that praying he had done had worked. God was looking out for him and saved him. However, when DeWitt put his truck in reverse and attempted to drive out of the snowbank, his tires just spun. They couldn't get traction. And so he realized, I survived the crash, but I may not be able to move. And I am up in the middle of the wilderness of the Oregon mountains. It's snowing like crazy. Like, what do I do? Also, it's the middle of the night. He doesn't have a phone, doesn't have a radio, so he has no way to call anyone for help. He also wasn't expecting to be stuck, by the side of the road, so he didn't have food or water or really any provisions. And he also hadn't seen another vehicle for a really long time. So he had no idea how frequently people use this road, especially in the winter. And also, he wasn't even supposed to be on this route. So if anybody went looking for him, they wouldn't look here. However, just as, panic began to overwhelm him, DeWitt took a deep breath, said another prayer. God had already saved him once, and DeWitt just had to trust that he would do it again. Somehow, DeWitt was able to calm down enough, maybe it was his faith, that he was able to sleep. However, when he woke up, it was clear, one, it's still snowing outside, but worse, it had been snowing clearly all night because his truck was now way more buried in snow. The snow literally made it all the way up to the edge of his window. It's like multiple feet of snow out there. And so DeWitt, he turned his car back on and he threw it in reverse again, seeing if maybe now he'd be able to back out, pretty unlikely, but as soon as he hit the accelerator, the tires clearly spun, he didn't move. Now, it was daylight, and so he's thinking, okay, maybe now I can look around and see a house, a building, or some sign of life somewhere in the distance, just to give me a sense of how close I am to other people. But when he looked out his window, all he could see in every direction were trees and snow. He actually couldn't even see the road anymore and had no idea where it was since he'd gotten all turned around during the crash. And so he's just like in this whiteout, basically. And so DeWitt, at this point, was trying his best not to panic. And so instead, he focused on, what do I have? What supplies do I have right now? And he sort of began looking around the inside of his truck. And he found he actually had a lot of useful stuff in here. There were some cushions and a sheet, so he could make a bed for himself to curl up in. And he could also use the truck's heater to keep himself warm and to melt snow for drinking water. He'd obviously just have to be, careful not to burn too much fuel. Also, DeWitt had the camper that was attached to the back of his truck, which you would think would be great for a situation like this. You can just live in the camper until you get rescued. Except DeWitt knew this was not really a real camper. It was a demo model. It was unfurnished, there was no heat, no supplies, nothing. It was really just a shell, so not that useful. But once DeWitt was done doing this mental inventory, even though in some ways he had basically realized, I have very little, he actually felt a sense of calm come over him. He felt like, what? I have enough to keep me alive for a while, and in that time, I'm going to be found. And so he would just leave it up to God to save him once again. 2 days later, the storm finally let up. But even with the now clear weather, the snow didn't melt. And then soon after that, another storm came and dumped more snow and ice all over his truck. Also, during this time frame, DeWitt didn't see any other cars or trucks or plows. So he had a feeling that the road he had crashed on was now so clogged with snow, it wasn't even usable. But even though at this point DeWitt was extremely hungry, he had no food, it's been several days here, he also was warm and dry inside of his truck. And critically, he was also hydrated. He'd been drinking plenty of melted snow, so he was, surviving as best as he could. And then also, to ward off all the negative, intrusive thoughts about what could happen to him out here, DeWitt had begun to pass the time by meticulously crossing off the days in his yearly planning calendar and also writing letters. DeWitt always carried around pen, paper, and envelopes inside of his work bag, which he obviously had with him. So he had begun writing to the people he loved, his fiancée, his sons, and even to his boss, to explain what had happened and why he had missed work. And in each letter, DeWitt did not sound scared or sad. In fact, if anything, he seemed rejuvenated. He seemed happy. He would reflect on how much love and joy was in his life and how lucky he was to have that. And he would tell the people he was writing letters to, like his fiancée and sons, that he really wasn't worried. He knew he was going to be okay because God was clearly looking out for him. The days turned into weeks, but DeWitt continued to stay warm and basically comfortable and alive, even without any food. But DeWitt believed that his hunger actually was a sign that God was looking out for him. DeWitt had no idea how long somebody could live literally without eating. But after 2 months, DeWitt had tracked the days in his calendar. 2 months had gone by. DeWitt felt like, I should be dead. I haven't eaten in 2 months. But he wasn't dead. And he felt like that was a sign. God was keeping him alive for his eventual rescue. It has to be. On the morning of May 20th, 1995, a teenager, along with his girlfriend, drove up the same mountain road that DeWitt had been on when he got into his accident. And even though it was May, there was quite a bit of snow still, and the road was still quite icy. And about halfway up a particularly steep incline, this teenage kid lost control of his truck. It began to skid, and he went off the road and crashed into a snowbank. Luckily, the teenager and his girlfriend were okay. And for a minute, they just sat there kind of dazed. And then the driver put the car in reverse and tried to move, but the car wouldn't move. The tires just spun. So eventually, the teenager climbed out of the car to examine his vehicle to see if there was serious damage here or if he was just stuck in the snow. But when he did this, when he climbed out of his vehicle, he looked just up the road a ways, and off the side of the road, basically equal to where he was relative to the road, was another vehicle. It was a pickup truck with a camper attached to it that was clearly half buried in the melting snow. And so the teenager told his girlfriend that he was going to go take a look in case, somebody else had a wreck and they needed help. So this kid, he leaves his girlfriend and he hikes over to the truck. And when he gets there, he can't see inside of it. It's covered with too much snow. But he brushes off some of the snow, revealing one of the windows into the truck. And he looked in, and for a second, he couldn't quite see what was in there. But then eventually he saw it. And when he did, he just gasped and backed up. After DeWitt crashed, he was certain he was going to be rescued. He knew he was in an isolated part of this mountain. I mean, he clearly knew that, but he really believed that God was going to save him. He felt like it was God who kept him from going off the cliff, and now God was going to intervene and save him, that somebody was going to show up and rescue him, effectively because of God. So because of that belief, because of how strongly he believed that, DeWitt did not get out of his truck. I mean, he got out maybe to use the bathroom, but for the most part, he stayed in his truck. And unfortunately, had he just gotten out and really looked around, he would have seen there was actually a paved path that, due to the way the winds whip on that side of the mountain, the snow doesn't stick to the ground. And so even with a huge snowstorm, he would have seen a black paved path going down the mountainside, and he could have walked it down to civilization, and it would have saved him. But DeWitt was so convinced that if he just waited here, somebody would save him because God was going to save him again. He just didn't leave his truck. And then when he began to feel that incredible ache from the starvation, the fact that he wasn't dying, months in with no food, it sort of built that resolve inside of him that clearly God has a plan. Clearly, I should be dead right now, and I am not. I need to maintain faith, and I'm going to be saved. And in many ways, that's beautiful. It's poetic in some ways. But it ultimately led to his death. That teenage driver who happened to get into a car accident up on that mountain road, who then saw the truck and the camper, well, that was obviously DeWitt's truck and camper. And when the teenager walked over and cleared the window and looked inside, he saw DeWitt, who was deceased inside of the truck. DeWitt ultimately died of starvation, most likely on January 19th, which is the final day that he crossed off on his calendar. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, MrBallen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Produced by Jeremy Bone. Story editing by Evan Allen. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Cole Lacasio, Perry Kroll, and Jordan Stidham. Mixed and mastered by Brendan Kane. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. And just a reminder, every new and exclusive episode we put out on the MrBallen podcast, you can also now watch on the MrBallen YouTube channel that very same day. And trust me, some of these stories you truly have to see to believe. Again, my YouTube channel is just called MrBallen. If you want to listen to episodes 1 week early and ad-free, you can subscribe to SiriusXM Podcast Plus on Apple Podcasts or visit SiriusXM.com/Podcast Plus to listen with Spotify or another app of your choice. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. One evening in August of 2000, a city council candidate stood behind a podium at a high school in small-town Alabama. He was speaking about why he'd entered the race in the first place, and he said it was because he wanted a platform to discuss a very important issue. And that issue was the unsolved murder of a local school district employee. And then, right there, in front of all the news cameras and microphones, this candidate said he knew who committed that crime, because it had been revealed to him in a dream. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the Strange, Dark, and Mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do. So if that's of interest to you, please invite the follow button to your next big house party. But don't give them the right address. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the morning of August 4th, 1998, a 49-year-old woman named Charlotte Waits rushed around her kitchen in Lynette, Alabama. She reached past her husband Barry, who was washing the dishes at the sink, and she grabbed a coffee mug from the cupboard. It was a Tuesday morning, and they were both getting ready for busy days at work. Charlotte was a school administrator, and Barry was the acting mayor of the small town of Lynette, a very tight-knit community of about 9,000 residents. And as Barry left the sink to go grab his briefcase from the dining room, Charlotte, who was pouring herself some coffee, reminded him that she had a hair appointment later that morning, and also that she'd be home later than usual because she had a meeting with her attorneys that afternoon. So Charlotte was unfortunately in the middle of a legal battle with her cousin Wayne over the inheritance from her late uncle's will. The uncle had left a lot of valuable land to Charlotte, but Wayne thought that he deserved some of that land too. So basically, he was contesting the will, and today was the day that Charlotte, Wayne, and their attorneys were going to meet and attempt to hash it out. Barry asked Charlotte if she had decided what she was going to say at this meeting. And Charlotte shook her head and said no, and said she was still kind of thinking it over. Now, she knew she didn't want to just give up the land, but she also knew that she didn't necessarily want to risk tearing her whole family apart over money. Barry walked over to her and put a hand on her shoulder and reassured her that whatever happened, the family would get through it. Then he gave her a kiss on the cheek, and he left for work. Once he was out the door, Charlotte left the kitchen and went upstairs and knocked on the bedroom door of her 17-year-old daughter, Kara. And as soon as she did this, Charlotte heard a groan from inside the room. So Charlotte opened the door up, and she found Kara curled up in bed. And Kara was looking very tired and very pale. But, Charlotte knew this was not just a teenager who didn't want to, go to school or something. The reason that Kara looked the way she did and was sounding the way she did is because Kara was pregnant, and she was dealing with pretty obvious morning sickness. Now, Charlotte was not thrilled about her 17-year-old daughter being pregnant. But more than that, she was especially not thrilled because she absolutely hated Kara's boyfriend, Dave Reed. Dave drank and got into trouble with the law, and he just was not the kind of guy Charlotte wanted her daughter around. At one point, before Kara was pregnant, Charlotte and Barry had forbid her from seeing Dave. They said, "You cannot date him." But in secret, the two had continued to see each other, and now Kara was pregnant. And so Charlotte really couldn't help but feel deeply disappointed in her daughter. But she also knew her daughter was going to need a lot of support from her, not just to finish high school, but also to be a teen mom. And so for right now, Charlotte was just trying to keep the peace. So with that in mind, Charlotte stepped into the bedroom and asked Kara how she was feeling. And Kara just kind of shrugged and said she was okay, just a little nauseous. Charlotte was sympathetic and nodded along and kind of helped straighten up her room for a second. And then she reminded Kara that her older sister Heather was coming home from college that night, and so it would be nice if they all had dinner together as a family. And Kara said, she did have a babysitting gig for basically the whole day, but she promised she would make it home for dinner. Charlotte was pleased and told Kara she would see her later that night, and then she said she had to get to work. So Charlotte left the bedroom, went downstairs, grabbed her purse, and then out the door she headed to the garage to go to her car. Later that same morning, around 11:30 a.m., Charlotte drove back down her quiet residential street toward her house. She lived in a respectable upper-middle-class neighborhood where basically all the neighbors seemed to know each other, and historically crime had been very low. Although recently there had been a string of robberies in the area, which had some people on edge, but for the most part, Charlotte and her family felt safe in their home. Charlotte was having a pretty hectic day. She'd had a very busy morning at work, and then she'd gone to the salon for a haircut, and pretty soon she had to get back to the office for a few more hours before her afternoon meeting with her cousin Wayne and all the lawyers. However, Charlotte never really liked how her hair looked right after leaving the salon. So first, she wanted to stop by her house and restyle it herself before heading back to work and finishing up her day. So she pulled into her garage and ran inside the house and went straight upstairs right to the bathroom. And as she was plugging in her blow dryer, she heard a door open downstairs. And the sound surprised her because she thought that Kara was off at her babysitting gig, and Barry, her husband, usually didn't come home during his lunch break. So she set the blow dryer down and went to go see who it was. A few hours later, around 4:30 p.m., Charlotte's 21-year-old daughter, Heather, pulled up to the house. She'd just arrived from college, which was located a few towns away, and she was excited to see her parents and sister when they all got home from work that night. But as Heather parked her car in the driveway, she noticed something odd. She saw the garage door was open and her mom's car was parked there. And this surprised her because when she had spoken to her mom on the phone the day before, Charlotte had said she probably wouldn't be home until around 6, but Heather didn't think much of it. So she just grabbed her laundry hamper and a couple of grocery bags filled with her stuff out of the back seat of the car. And then as she walked into the garage to make her way into the house, she saw the door that led into the house was actually already open, but just a crack, which was kind of odd. Like there's no reason that door would be left open. And so now, sensing that maybe something was off here, Heather walked up and slowly pushed that door open, and she just called out for her mother to see what she was doing, but there was no answer. And so Heather stepped into the house, into the kitchen, and set down her hamper and the bags, and then she began walking around the first floor of the house to just see where her mom was. She didn't hear her, she couldn't see her. She's just walking around, and as she rounded the corner into the foyer, she saw her mom. But her mom was laying at the foot of the stairs, totally motionless. Heather immediately ran to her mom and just grabbed her to see if she was okay, but when she touched her mom's leg, it was ice cold. And so she ran into the other room, picked up the phone, and called 911. A few minutes later, Lieutenant Richard Carter of the Lynette Police Department sped down Charlotte's residential street with his lights flashing and siren blaring. He was responding to a 911 call about a woman who had been found unresponsive. And he'd been very surprised when the dispatcher told him whose house this woman had been found inside of. It was the home of the town's mayor, Barry Waits. Now, as he pulled up in front of the home, he saw this young woman come running out the front door, crying hysterically. And so Lieutenant Carter, he stopped his car, he got out, and he intercepted the young woman, who begged him to come in and help her mom. And so Carter and this young woman rushed over to the house, and then he told her to stay outside while he went in and investigated. And so she did. She stayed out front and just quietly wept to herself, while Lieutenant Carter stepped through the front door, and right away, right inside, he saw what appeared to be a middle-aged woman lying on her back at the bottom of a staircase, and she was totally motionless. Nearby, the contents of a purse were strewn all across the floor. Carter immediately knelt down and felt for a pulse on this woman, but there was nothing. And so Carter, he stood back up and just kind of assessed the scene, and what he noticed was there was foam at the corner of this woman's mouth. So he wondered if maybe she had had a seizure or some sort of allergic reaction at the top of the stairs and sort of had lost her balance and maybe fell down the stairs and the fall had killed her. But then he also noticed there were definitely a few drops of blood on the front of her blouse. And when he looked closer at her face, he noticed there were pretty obvious scratch marks on her chin and also a red mark around her neck. And he realized this woman likely had not just fallen down the stairs. She'd been attacked, beaten, and potentially strangled. Later that day, around 5 p.m., Lieutenant Richard Carter sorted through a pile of dirty laundry on the floor of Charlotte Waits' laundry room. For the past half hour, he'd been scouring the crime scene for clues, and now he was holding 2 white towels that were dotted with reddish-brown spots that looked like blood that had just begun to dry. He called over a forensics officer and told him to take the towels into evidence. He couldn't be sure yet that the blood was even Charlotte's, but if it was, it could be a potential clue. After searching the whole house, Carter actually had a pretty strong theory about what had happened to Charlotte. There were no signs of forced entry, and the TV and other valuables were still in the home. Charlotte's purse had been dumped out on the floor just a few feet away from the stairs, but her cash and her credit cards were still in her wallet. So Carter did not think this was a robbery gone wrong. He thought maybe the killer just kind of dumped out the purse at the end to make it seem like a robbery, but it was a weak attempt. This did not seem like a robbery. What this seemed like, at least to Carter at this point, was that Charlotte had been intentionally killed by somebody that she knew. But just then, Carter heard commotion by the front door, and so he went to go see what was going on, and he saw there was a man out on the doorstep literally being physically held back by 2 forensics officers. And then after a second, Carter recognized who it was. It was the town's mayor, Barry Waits, the victim's husband. The officers were trying to keep him outside, but Barry pushed past them, and right away, he saw what they were kind of keeping him from, which was his wife's body laying there on the floor, obviously dead. And when Barry saw that, he just froze and began to hyperventilate. At this point, Carter didn't try to force Barry back outside. Instead, he gently grabbed Barry's arm and led him into the next room and sat him down on the couch and just tried to get him to calm down, but it was like he couldn't. Barry was gasping and really was struggling to breathe, and then he actually doubled over and clutched at his chest. And Carter thought maybe he's having a heart attack. And so instead of trying to talk to him, he just yelled for somebody to call an ambulance. Later that same night, around 8 p.m., Lieutenant Carter stepped into the lobby of the local hospital's emergency department. He showed his badge to the nurse at the front desk and then asked to see Barry Waits. But the nurse said he would have to wait because they were still running tests on Barry and he couldn't have any visitors until they were sure he was stable. And Carter was pretty disappointed to hear this. Not because he was, desperate to get in there and console the mayor. It was actually because he needed to talk to the mayor. This is the spouse of a potential murder victim. He needed to know what Barry knew. And so he turned to leave, but before he did, he noticed sitting in the waiting room was Barry and Charlotte's daughter, Heather, who, Carter and Heather, they had spoken for a few minutes back at the house earlier that day when, Heather was the one who came running out and directed him into the house. They had spoken a little bit, but Carter thought, if I can't talk to Barry, maybe I can talk to Heather. Maybe she's calmed down enough that we could have a real conversation right now. And so he walked over to her. As Carter approached, Heather looked up and definitely recognized who he was and sort of gave off body language that it was okay for him to come and sit down. And so Carter, he walked over, he sat down next to her, and he saw there was actually another girl, a teenager, who was sitting next to Heather, and Heather quickly turned and pointed to her and said this was her younger sister, Kara. Lieutenant Carter nodded and introduced himself to Kara, and then he asked both women, how was their dad doing? And Heather said that the doctors so far believed he was not having a heart attack, that it was likely a panic attack, but they were going to monitor him overnight just to be sure. Both of the girls seemed very upset. They had tears in their eyes, they both appeared to be in shock, they hadn't done anything suspicious, really. Carter knew he couldn't just rule them out as suspects yet. He had to really ask them some pointed questions. So he took out his notebook, and as delicately as he could, he began asking them some questions. So by this point, Carter's officers had already learned that Charlotte had left her work around 11 a.m. that morning. And it was not until about 1 p.m. that her coworkers called her house because she had not come back to work. And they said there was no answer. And so that meant the murder had likely taken place sometime between 11 a.m. and 1 p.m. So with that in mind, Carter asked Heather and Kara where they'd been that morning and afternoon, with a focus on 11 to 1. Kara told him she'd been babysitting all day. and Heather said she'd been at her school, her college, which was 30 miles away, until around 4 p.m. that afternoon when she had left to drive to her parents' house. At some point, Carter asked both of them if they had any idea if there was someone out there who might have had a grudge against their mother, or who might have wanted to hurt their mom, or who might have, been happy if something happened to her. And the girls immediately shook their head and said, absolutely not. There was no one. I mean, their mom was awesome. Everybody seemed to like her, and they were a happy, normal family. There was no issues they knew of. Carter jotted all this down in his notebook, and his plan was to check out the daughters' alibis as soon as he got back to the station. The next day, Lieutenant Carter was at the precinct debriefing with the other investigators on Charlotte's case. He'd listened to the local news on the radio while driving to work that morning, and since Charlotte was the acting mayor's wife, her murder was all anybody in town could talk about. So Carter was really feeling a lot of pressure to solve this case quickly. Now, by this point, he had already followed up on Heather and Kara's alibis, and they had both checked out. Neither of the daughters could have been home between 11 and 1, so Carter had officially ruled them out as suspects. And so now the other officers were going around the room basically updating Carter on what they had done the night before. And Carter was admittedly a little frustrated to hear that after they had questioned Charlotte's neighbors and coworkers right after they had gotten to the scene, that had not led to any new suspects. And also, another point of frustration was the one person who likely would be able to help them the most, at least at this point in the investigation, was the acting mayor, Barry, Charlotte's husband. But he was still in the hospital and so was not being allowed to speak to them. But just as Carter and the others were sort of scratching their heads wondering what they were going to do next, the front door of the precinct opened, and who walked in but Barry Waits. A few minutes later, Lieutenant Carter and Barry were sitting in Carter's office. Barry said he had just been released from the hospital, and they had determined that his heart was fine, and he really had just had a panic attack. So as soon as he was out of the hospital, he'd come right over here to see what he could do to help with the investigation. And so Carter asked Barry to walk him through what he had done the previous day, the day Charlotte was killed. Barry said that on top of being the acting mayor, he was also the head of the local National Guard Armory, and he had been attending to business at the armory all day. He did say he left at some point to get a haircut, maybe mid-morning, but the barbershop was closed, so he went right back to work, and he had stayed there until around 4:30 when he got a panicked phone call from his daughter Heather telling him their mom was unresponsive in the house. As Barry spoke, Carter actually primarily was just looking at Barry's hands and arms to see if there were any scratches or cuts or bruises, because the running theory, based on what they saw at the crime scene, is that Charlotte put up a fight against her attacker before she was killed, and so presumably there should be wounds of some kind on the attacker, and probably on their hands and arms. But as Carter stared at Barry, there were no visible injuries at all. And also, Barry's story seemed very linear, very simple, and he seemed very earnest about it and eager to help. And so, Carter couldn't just jump to conclusions and assume that Barry was, telling the truth and that he was not a suspect here. But Carter's first impression was that Barry was telling the truth. At some point, Carter kind of shifted the conversation and asked Barry if he had any idea about who might have wanted to hurt his wife. And Barry said, yes, he did. There were actually 2 people who would definitely benefit from Charlotte being dead. He said the first person was this guy named Dave Reed, who was actually their daughter Kara's boyfriend. He said that he and Charlotte had tried to stop Kara from seeing this guy because he was kind of a bad guy, but the teens had kept sneaking around, and eventually Dave had gotten Kara pregnant. And so Barry wondered if maybe Dave had gone over to sort of confront Charlotte, to maybe demand to be able to see Kara, and things got out of hand. Carter grabbed a pen and he wrote down Dave's full name. Then he asked about the second person who had been a problem with Charlotte. He explained that his wife and her cousin were in the middle of this contentious dispute over an inheritance. In fact, he said Charlotte had been scheduled to meet with Wayne and their attorneys the same day that she was killed. And when he heard this, Carter sat up in his chair because he thought to himself that the timing here could not be a coincidence. The cousin was suddenly his top suspect. The following day, Carter walked into an interrogation room at the Lynette police station, and he sat down across the table from 2 people, Wayne Rice and his attorney. When Carter had called Wayne to set up this meeting, Wayne had responded by saying he would not say a word without his lawyer present. And this made Carter pretty suspicious because during this very brief phone call, Carter had never even suggested to Wayne that he was a suspect in his cousin's murder. So when Carter sat down with Wayne and his lawyer, he pretty much leaned right in and grilled Wayne. He wanted to know what was going on with this inheritance. Wayne said he knew that his contesting their uncle's will had caused a lot of problems within the family. But he said that he hadn't wished any harm on Charlotte. And in fact, she'd been his best ally at the time of her death. Carter asked him to explain what he meant by that. And Wayne said that the last time he spoke to Charlotte, she seemed to be in favor of giving him some of the land that their uncle had left to her. According to Wayne, Charlotte had said she was really upset about the family being torn apart over money, and she felt like keeping all the land for herself was just not worth it. And when Carter heard this, he was pretty surprised, because Barry had made it sound like Charlotte had no intention of giving up the land to Wayne, like that wasn't even an option. So Carter wondered if anything Wayne was saying here was even true. He asked Wayne for his alibi, and Wayne said he'd literally been at work all day at an aluminum processing plant just outside of town. He said he hadn't even left for lunch, something he typically did, like he was at work truly all day. And then he also gave Carter the names of several coworkers who could confirm his whereabouts. Before Carter let Wayne go, he asked him if he could take his fingerprints. And Wayne immediately looked at his attorney, and his attorney kind of nodded at him. And so Wayne looked at Carter and said, okay. Later that same day, Carter sat down with the other suspect on his list, Kara's boyfriend, Dave. Dave was very moody and standoffish and just seemed kind of annoyed that he was even there. When Carter asked him if he knew why he'd been called to the station in the first place, Dave just kind of sighed and said, yeah, I do. He'd heard about what happened to Kara's mother, and he knew, given his contentious relationship with her and her husband, that of course he was going to be viewed as a suspect, which to him was absurd. And so Carter actually just asked Dave point blank about his relationship with Kara's parents. And Dave would admit that, yeah, they definitely didn't like him. But Dave insisted he would never hurt Charlotte, or Barry for that matter, and he hadn't even been in town the day that she was killed. He'd been at work all day at a landscaping job miles away. Carter asked for the names of some of Dave's coworkers to verify his alibi, and he also asked him to provide his fingerprints, to which Dave sort of rolled his eyes and said, you're wasting your time, but he said he would do it just because he wanted to clear his name. A couple of weeks later, in the middle of August, Lieutenant Carter sat at his desk flipping through Charlotte's autopsy report, which he had just received from the medical examiner. And he realized that Charlotte's murder had been even more brutal than he had thought. It turned out the murder weapon had been Charlotte's own blouse. Her killer had grabbed the strings dangling from her neckline and then used them to strangle her to death. She'd also received a pretty serious head injury that could have been fatal on its own, and she also had a broken wrist. Now, this level of violence made Carter feel even more sure that this murder had to have been personal. But as he read deeper into the report, the evidence seemed to paint a different picture. There were 3 sets of fingerprints found at the crime scene, and 2 of them belonged to Barry and Kara, which was not a surprise because they lived in the house. But the 3rd set of prints was actually unidentified, and it wasn't a match for any of the suspects on Carter's radar, including Kara's boyfriend Dave and Charlotte's cousin Wayne. So at this point, Lieutenant Carter just felt kind of stuck. Also, Barry, Wayne, and Dave's alibis had all checked out as well, so truly his list of suspects was basically down to 0. So if Charlotte had been killed by someone she knew, which was the initial running theory, Carter was going to have to dig even harder to find out who it was. In October of 1998, so a couple of months after Charlotte Waits was killed, Lieutenant Carter walked into the Lynette Police Precinct right as the desk sergeant was hanging up the phone. The sergeant stopped Carter and told him they had just gotten yet another call on the Charlotte Waits tip line. And before the sergeant even explained what the caller had said, Carter felt dread building in the pit of his stomach. Ever since the police had set up this tip line for information on Charlotte's murder, it had been flooded with calls basically every day. But rather than all these tips helping with the case, the tip line had actually just slowed the investigation down because Carter and his team had to take time to follow up on every single one of these leads, even though most of them were just rumors and conspiracy theories. By this point, from all these tips, they'd looked into a young man who lived on the same street as Charlotte and who had a history of robbing houses, but he had an airtight alibi. They'd also investigated another local man who'd strangled his girlfriend in a similar way to how Charlotte was attacked, but he also had an alibi. Carter had even driven all the way to Georgia to investigate a tip that a small-time criminal had bragged at a party about killing Charlotte, only to find out this small-time criminal had an alibi too, and that the tipster had made the whole story up just to get him in trouble. Also, in addition to these new suspects having alibis, their prints didn't match the prints found at the crime scene, that third set of prints. But sort of adding more confusion to this was an expert told Carter that actually it seems like those third prints could belong to a child, and so maybe were totally unrelated to the murder. And so now, as Carter looked over at this desk sergeant who was getting ready to tell him about whatever call he had just had, Carter just braced for more bad news, because all these tip calls were basically bad news. And when the desk sergeant spoke, it was more bad news. The sergeant said this call wasn't even a tip at all. A local woman had just called in to complain about the lack of progress. And as difficult as it was for Carter to hear that now, in addition to the pressure he was feeling, that locals were literally spamming the hotline just to complain about him, that was bad. But Carter also understood their frustration, because he was actually feeling just as upset as everybody else in town. But after running into nothing but dead ends here, he was out of ideas. And he had a feeling in his gut that unless something major changed soon, this case, unfortunately, was going to go cold. Fast forward about 3 years to one morning in 2001. On this day, Lieutenant Carter was working at his desk when he heard a familiar sound. The precinct's tip line was ringing yet again. After that initial wave of tips on the Charlotte Waits case, the case had completely stalled out for a couple of years. It was basically cold. Carter had ultimately been reassigned to other cases, and Charlotte's family had just sort of been forced to move on without any sort of closure. Kara had her baby, and Heather graduated college and was, working a real job. And Barry had also basically moved on with his life. He had gotten remarried and was still very much in politics. And in fact, just the previous year, he'd run for a term on city council. However, during that election cycle, Barry's opponent had publicly accused him of killing his wife, Charlotte. And even though he had no actual evidence to support his accusation, aside from the fact that he had a dream about it, all the attention from these accusations had totally reinvigorated the case, and calls had once again begun flowing to this tip line. However, just like before, the vast majority of these tips were just wild theories and gossip. But that particular day, when the desk sergeant who manned the tip line opened up Carter's office, Carter looked up and saw he was visibly excited, like whatever he had just heard on the tip line actually mattered. And before Carter could even ask him, what'd you hear? The desk sergeant said he had just spoken to 2 tipsters who clearly had some real information that they wanted to share that was going to blow this case wide open. Based on that crucial tip, forensic evidence, and witness testimony, this is what police believe happened to Charlotte Waits on August 4th, 1998. Around 11:30 a.m., the killer pulled up outside of Charlotte's house and right away recognized Charlotte's car in the garage. And when they saw it, their heart raced with excitement because they hadn't been sure that she'd even be home. But clearly, the killer had gotten here right at the right time. So they parked at the end of the driveway, and they walked up into the garage, and they walked over to the door that led into the house. And they tried the handle and found it was unlocked, so they opened it up. The killer stepped inside the kitchen, and right away, they heard footsteps on the second floor. And they knew it had to be Charlotte. There was nobody else home. So the killer closed the door, they went around to the stairs that led to the second floor, and up they went. And right as the killer reached the second floor hallway, Charlotte came out of the bathroom and saw them. And Charlotte was definitely very surprised to see them standing there. But the killer immediately just asked her a question, point blank. And when she answered the question, it was not what the killer wanted to hear. And so the killer tried to get her to change her mind, to answer this question differently, but the conversation quickly escalated into a full-blown argument. And then the killer just totally lost their temper and hit Charlotte across the face. Blood immediately began pouring out of Charlotte's nose, and kind of stunned, she just kind of stepped back and went back into the bathroom to grab a towel to blot her face with it. Now, at this point, the killer knew they had crossed a line. And so persuading Charlotte at this point to do what they wanted was clearly out of the question. This was a no going back moment. So as Charlotte came out of the bathroom with this towel on her face looking totally shaken up, the killer walked up and grabbed her from behind, and they clutched the strings that were hanging from the neckline of her blouse, and they pulled them tight around her neck. And so Charlotte began gasping for breath and trying to fight them off, but the killer absolutely had her in this chokehold. And then finally, when Charlotte had lost enough oxygen that she stopped struggling, the killer let go of the strings and then kicked her down the staircase. And when the killer saw what they had done, when they saw Charlotte at the base of the stairs, obviously motionless, very likely dead, the reality of what they had just done, it hit them. And so in a panic, they grabbed the bloody towel that Charlotte had dropped. She was using to blot her nose, but she had dropped it on the ground. They grabbed that and they rushed down the stairs and kind of cleaned up the rest of the blood on Charlotte's face and then dumped the towels in the laundry room. Then they grabbed Charlotte's purse off the table and kind of scattered its contents on the floor near her body, hoping the police would think this was a robbery gone wrong. And then after that, they fled the house, got back in their car, and hurried back to work at the National Guard Armory before anyone even noticed they were gone. The killer was Lynette, Alabama's mayor, and Charlotte's own husband, Barry Waits. Barry had secretly gotten into a lot of debt, and he needed the full inheritance from Charlotte's uncle to pay it off. And so when Barry went to his own home in the middle of the day and basically confronted Charlotte and asked her, "What do you plan to do at this meeting with Wayne? Are you going to give him some of this inheritance?" And she told him that yes, her plan was to settle and split the inheritance. Well, when Barry heard that, he snapped and he killed his wife. Not just because he was mad at her for her decision, but also because he needed more money. He's thinking, okay, I'm going to get half of this inheritance because she's given the other half to Wayne, but if I kill her, I'll get her life insurance policy, and then together I'll have enough to pay off my debts. However, when the insurance company went to pay out the claim, because Barry early on in the investigation was clearly a suspect in his wife's murder, the company would not pay him the money. Instead, they paid the insurance money to their daughters. But a couple of years later, Barry still tried to get his hands on that money by tricking his own daughters into signing it over to him. But when Heather and Kara realized what he was doing, they finally saw their father for what he was. And so it was the daughters who were the tipsters who broke this case wide open. They told Lieutenant Carter everything they knew about their dad's very suspicious behavior, along with his clear financial motives for the murder. They also said that their father had intimidated them into hiding information from the police and had even called in fake tips to redirect attention away from himself. Barry Waits was arrested in February of 2006, and 9 months later, he was found guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to 40 years in prison. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, MrBallen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen, produced by Jeremy Bone. This episode was written by Kate Gallagher. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Cole Lacasio. Additional audio editing by Jordan Stidham. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Minata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. And just a reminder, every new and exclusive episode we put out on the MrBallen podcast, you can also now watch on the MrBallen YouTube channel that very same day. And trust me, some of these stories you truly have to see to believe. Again, my YouTube channel is just called MrBallen. If you want to listen to episodes 1 week early and ad-free, you can subscribe to SiriusXM Podcast Plus on Apple Podcasts or visit SiriusXM.com/Podcast Plus to listen with Spotify or another app of your choice. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.